Welcome, young seeker of wisdom, to a tale woven from starlight and shadow, where brilliance burns brightest before it fades forever. Tonight, we follow the extraordinary life of Rowena Ravenclaw, a woman whose mind could pierce the veils of time itself, whose wisdom shaped the very foundations of magical learning, whose heart bore tragedies that would have shattered lesser souls. As you settle into your peaceful sanctuary, let these words carry you through the life of perhaps the most brilliant witch who ever lived. A story where every vision was both gift and curse, every choice carved in consequence and regret. Close your eyes and drift into this chronicle of infinite wisdom, where the pursuit of knowledge demanded prices that even the wisest could not foresee, and where love and loss danced together beneath the ancient Scottish stars. In the mist-shrouded highlands of ancient Scotland, where primordial magic flowed through granite and heather like blood through veins, there stood a tower that had weathered 1,000 storms and would endure 1,000 more. The Ravenclaw stronghold rose from the mountainside like a finger pointed accusingly at heaven, its stones dark with age and secrets, its windows gleaming like watchful eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. The winds that howled around its battlements carried whispers of power that stretched back to the dawn of magic itself, when the first witches and wizards learned to bend reality to their will, and discovered that such bending came with costs written in languages older than words. It was into this legacy of power and burden that Rowena Ravenclaw was born on a night when the aurora borealis painted the sky in shades of green and silver, as if the very heavens were celebrating the arrival of someone destined to reshape the magical world. The midwife who delivered her would later swear that the child's first cry harmonized with the wind in perfect magical resonance, and that her eyes, when they opened for the first time, reflected not the ceiling above, but images of places that existed only in possibility and time yet to come. Even as an infant, there was something different about her that made visitors uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. Where other babies reached for bright objects or familiar faces, Rowena's gaze would track movement across rooms with focus that seemed far too intense for someone who had existed for mere weeks. Her first magical sign came not through the accidental outbursts that marked most magical children, but through something far more unsettling. An ability to see what wasn't there, to respond to events that hadn't happened, to cry at empty air, as if reacting to tragedies that existed only in the realm of potential. Her mother, Morgana Ravenclaw, recognized the signs immediately because she bore them herself, as had her mother before her, stretching back through generations of women who had been blessed and cursed with the inner eye. The sight, as it was known in the old tongue, was both the greatest treasure and heaviest burden that the Ravenclaw bloodline could pass to its daughters. Those who possessed it could glimpse fragments of the future, see through the veils that separated present from possibility, understand the hidden connections that bound all things together in webs of cause and consequence. But such gifts came with prices that ordinary minds could never comprehend. The future was not meant for mortal understanding, and those who gazed too deeply into tomorrow often found that today became unbearable by comparison. Morgana had learned to control her visions through disciplines that bordered on cruelty, training her mind to observe without feeling, to see without caring, to know without hoping. The alternative was madness, and she had seen too many seers lose themselves in the terrible beauty of what was to come. The Ravenclaw Tower had known generations of such women, each one shaped by visions that revealed truths too vast for comfortable comprehension. The walls were lined not just with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, but with records of their prophecies, journals that documented the prices they had paid for their extraordinary sight. Each entry told the same story in different words: power that isolated, knowledge that wounded, futures that could be seen but never changed. Young Rowena's childhood was shaped by training that would have broken spirits less naturally suited to such harsh discipline. Where other magical children played with enchanted toys and listened to fairy tales, she spent hours in meditation chambers designed to enhance psychic reception, learning to control the flood of images that threatened to overwhelm her developing mind. Her nursery was warded not against physical dangers, but against the kind of spiritual contamination that could corrupt a seer's gift, turning prophetic ability into mere delusion or wishful thinking. The visions began as fragmentary glimpses, like looking at the world through water or colored glass. She would see faces she didn't recognize, engaged in conversations she couldn't hear, places that existed nowhere in her experience, events that seemed to belong to stories rather than reality. But as she grew, the images became more coherent and more disturbing. She began to see patterns in the chaos, connections between seemingly unrelated fragments that suggested purposes too large for her child's mind to grasp. Her mother's approach to education was systematic and unforgiving, based on principles that had been refined through generations of necessity. Emotion was weakness, attachment was vulnerability, hope was the enemy of clear sight. The future was not shown to seers so that they might change it, but so that they might prepare for what could not be avoided. Love, joy, simple human connection. These were luxuries that those touched by prophecy could not afford when the price of distraction might be the failure to see disaster approaching. The lessons were conducted in chambers deep within the tower, where ancient magic had soaked into the stones like wine into cloth. Here, surrounded by artifacts that hummed with accumulated power, Morgana taught her daughter to build walls within her own mind, barriers that could contain visions without destroying the vessel that received them. The process was agonizing, requiring the deliberate cultivation of emotional distance that went against every natural instinct for connection and warmth. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of Rowena's education was the knowledge that her mother's harshness came from love. Twisted though that love might be by the demands of their extraordinary gift, Morgana had endured the same training, suffered the same isolation, paid the same prices that she was now demanding from her daughter. The coldness was not cruelty, but necessity, armor forged in the fires of terrible experience and hammered into shape by the understanding that the alternative to such preparation was destruction. The tower itself seemed to respond to Rowena's developing abilities, its ancient enchantments shifting and strengthening as her power grew. Portraits began to whisper secrets when she passed, their painted eyes tracking her movement with interest that bordered on hunger. The library's books rearranged themselves during the night, bringing volumes of prophecy and divination to positions where she would notice them first. Even the weather around the tower began to reflect her emotional states, with storms gathering when her visions were particularly dark and clear skies emerging when she achieved the detached serenity that her training demanded. The other children of the local magical community learned to avoid her, sensing something different that made normal childhood interactions impossible. Where they played games of tag and hide and seek, Rowena practiced exercises in psychic shielding and temporal perception. Where they formed friendships based on shared interests and innocent affection, she learned to evaluate everyone she met as potential sources of prophetic information or threats to her developing abilities. The isolation was complete and carefully maintained, necessary protection for gifts that were too precious and too dangerous to risk through casual association. Her magical education began earlier and proceeded more intensively than anything that would later be considered normal, even by the standards of prestigious magical families. By age 7, she could identify the signatures of different types of prophetic vision, distinguishing between true sight and mere wishful thinking. By 9, she had mastered basic temporal magic, learning to anchor her consciousness in the present while allowing her awareness to drift through layers of possibility. By 11, she could read the magical auras that surrounded every person, seeing not just their current state, but the potential futures that radiated from their choices like ripples from stones dropped in still water. But it was the recurring vision that truly defined her childhood. The image that appeared with increasing frequency and clarity as her abilities matured. She would see a field of white flowers, their petals pale as bone in moonlight, swaying in breezes that carried the scent of approaching doom. Above the flowers, she could hear a woman's voice raised in screams of terror and anguish, though the source of that voice remained hidden in shadows that no amount of psychic effort could penetrate. And always, at the vision's climax, there was blood, crimson spreading across white petals like ink across parchment, staining everything it touched with finality and regret. Her mother dismissed these visions as products of an untrained mind, echoes of emotional resonance that would fade as Rowena learned proper control. But the images persisted, growing stronger rather than weaker, carrying a weight of inevitability that suggested prophetic truth rather than psychological projection. Something terrible was approaching, some tragedy that would reshape everything she understood about her life and purpose. And all her training and emotional detachment couldn't eliminate the cold dread that settled deeper into her bones with each repetition of the vision. The relationship between mother and daughter was complicated by the demands of their shared gift, creating bonds that were simultaneously intimate and distant, loving and cruel. Morgana understood Rowena's struggles because she had experienced them herself, but that understanding manifested as harsh discipline rather than comfort, recognition that sympathy would only make the necessary training more difficult. Every kind word was weakness that might compromise Rowena's development. Every gentle touch a crack in the armor that protected seers from the overwhelming nature of their abilities. Yet beneath the coldness, Rowena could sometimes glimpse her mother's true feelings, moments when Morgana's careful control slipped enough to reveal the love and pride that drove her seemingly heartless methods. These glimpses were precious and rare, treasured memories that Rowena would carry with her long after the training was complete and its purposes became clear. Her mother was creating not just a seer but a weapon, someone whose abilities could serve purposes larger than personal happiness or family connection. The servants in the tower learned to move quietly around the young seer, understanding that her presence required a different kind of respect than mere noble birth would demand. They had seen other children struggle with such training and fail, their minds shattered by forces too great for human comprehension. That Rowena endured and even thrived under such conditions marked her as extraordinary, someone destined for achievements that would echo through centuries of magical history. As her 13th birthday approached, the visions began to change in ways that suggested approaching crisis. The white flowers appeared more frequently, their images so vivid that she could smell their perfume and feel the texture of their petals against her fingertips. The woman's screams grew clearer, carrying tones of desperation that suggested not just death but betrayal, loss that went beyond mere physical destruction. Most disturbing of all, she began to recognize elements of the vision in her daily life. Flowers that matched those in her dreams, locations that seemed familiar despite being places she had never visited, faces that appeared first in prophecy and then in reality. Her mother's health began to decline around this time, though whether from natural causes or the accumulated strain of a lifetime spent channeling prophetic energies was impossible to determine. The sight extracted tolls that went beyond mere mental exhaustion, aging those who possessed it in ways that conventional healing could not address. Morgana's hair turned white seemingly overnight. Her eyes developed the distant look of someone who spent more time in tomorrow than today, and her voice took on the hollow quality that marked seers who had seen too much of what was to come. The training intensified as Morgana recognized that her time was growing short and there were still lessons that needed to be imparted before Rowena would have to face the world alone. The final techniques were the most dangerous, methods for projecting consciousness across vast distances in time and space, for reading the deepest motivations that drove people toward their destinies, for understanding the cosmic forces that shaped individual fate and collective history. Each lesson required Rowena to venture closer to the edge of sanity, to risk losing herself in the vast tapestry of possibility that her enhanced perception could now access. The last gift her mother gave her was the most precious and terrible of all, the knowledge that the visions of white flowers and blood were not distant possibilities but approaching certainties, events that would soon reshape both their lives in ways that no amount of preparation could prevent. The sight had shown Morgana her own death years before it would occur, and now it was showing Rowena the circumstances that would lead to that tragedy. The price of prophetic ability was not just seeing the future, but being unable to change it, forced to watch helplessly as terrible events unfolded exactly as they had been foreseen. The education that had shaped Rowena's childhood was nearing its completion, but the lessons it had taught would influence every choice she made for the rest of her extraordinary life. She had learned to value knowledge above emotion, wisdom above comfort, truth above hope. These qualities would make her one of the greatest witches of her age. But they would also set in motion the tragedies that would define her legacy and ultimately destroy everything she valued most. The dance with destiny had begun, and like all such dances, it would end in ways that even the most gifted seer could not foresee or prevent. The spring of Rowena's 14th year brought changes that whispered of endings, though she could not yet decipher the language they spoke. The ancient tower that had sheltered her childhood seemed to hold its breath, as if the very stones sensed the approaching fulfillment of prophecies that had haunted its halls for generations. The air itself felt charged with possibility and dread, heavy with the weight of choices that had not yet been made, but whose consequences already cast shadows across the future that only seers' eyes could perceive. Morgana's health had declined through the harsh winter, her body weakened by years of channeling visions that were never meant for mortal minds to contain. The sight had aged her beyond her years, carving lines of foreknowledge into her face like runes etched in weathered stone. Her hands shook when she held her wand, and her eyes had taken on the distant quality of someone who spent more time in tomorrow than today. Yet her dedication to Rowena's education never wavered, driven by the terrible understanding that their time together was measured in months rather than years. The lessons had grown more intense as spring approached, focusing on practical applications of prophetic ability that would be essential for survival in the wider world. Morgana taught her daughter to read the magical signatures that surrounded every person, the invisible auras that revealed not just current intentions but potential futures that radiated from each choice like branches from a tree. She learned to distinguish between true visions and wishful thinking, to recognize when her sight was being influenced by hope or fear rather than genuine prophetic perception. But it was the interpretation of her recurring vision that proved most challenging. The field of white flowers, the woman's screams, the spreading blood. These images had haunted Rowena's dreams for years, growing more vivid with each repetition. Morgana insisted they were symbolic rather than literal, representations of emotional truths rather than actual events. The white flowers might represent purity corrupted. The screams could symbolize the pain of transformation. The blood might indicate sacrifice rather than death. Such interpretations were common among seers, who learned to read prophecy as poetry rather than plain text. Yet something about the vision's consistency and clarity suggested otherwise. True prophetic dreams carried a weight of inevitability that symbolic visions lacked. a resonance that echoed through both present and future with crystalline certainty. Rowena had learned to recognize this quality through years of training, and her recurring nightmare possessed it in abundance. Something terrible was approaching, some event that would fulfill the vision's imagery with literal rather than metaphorical accuracy. The day itself began like any other in their carefully ordered routine. Morgana rose before dawn to perform the meditation exercises that maintained her psychic clarity, while Rowena practiced the shielding techniques that protected her developing abilities from outside interference. They broke their fast in silence, as was their custom, allowing their minds to settle into the receptive state that made advanced sight possible. The morning lessons focused on temporal perception, learning to experience multiple time streams simultaneously without losing anchor in the present moment. It was during these exercises that the first signs of change became apparent. Instead of the controlled glimpses of possibility that training usually provided, Rowena found herself experiencing flashes of immediate future with startling clarity. She saw herself and her mother walking through unfamiliar countryside, saw Morgana tending to wounded figures on blood-soaked earth, saw white flowers swaying in breezes that carried the scent of approaching doom. The visions were so vivid that she could taste the metallic tang of spilled blood on her tongue, feel the soft petals of soapwort beneath her fingers. When she tried to share these images with her mother, Morgana's response was characteristic of her practical approach to prophetic phenomena. Visions that seemed urgent often proved to be tests of a seer's emotional control rather than genuine glimpses of destiny. The future revealed itself according to its own mysterious purposes, not in response to human curiosity or anxiety. Attempting to force interpretation or act on incomplete information was more dangerous than ignoring the visions entirely. But fate, it seemed, had already set events in motion that would give Rowena no choice in the matter. A messenger arrived at the tower that afternoon, a young wizard whose exhaustion and blood-stained robes spoke of desperate urgency. He brought word from the local magical community of a battle between Muggle warlords that had left hundreds dead and dying in a field barely 10 miles from their stronghold. The survivors needed healing that only magical intervention could provide. But the journey would be dangerous, and the work itself exhausting. Such requests came regularly to the Ravenclaw Tower, for Morgana's reputation as a healer extended far beyond her abilities as a seer. The ancient pact between magical and non-magical peoples might have been forgotten by most, but she remembered the obligations that bound those with power to protect those without. Her healing abilities were considerable, enhanced by prophetic insight that allowed her to anticipate complications and address problems before they became life-threatening. This time, however, she made a decision that surprised both Rowena and herself. For the first time in their carefully structured relationship, she invited her daughter to accompany her on a mission that would expose her to the harsh realities of human suffering and magical responsibility. Perhaps she sensed that Rowena's education was nearing completion, and that practical experience was needed to transform theoretical knowledge into usable wisdom. Or perhaps her declining health made her reluctant to venture forth alone, though pride would never allow her to admit such weakness. Rowena's initial excitement at this unprecedented invitation was tempered by growing unease as they prepared for departure. The white flowers in her visions had been identified during her botanical studies as soapwort, a plant that grew in specific soil conditions and bloomed at particular times of year. If her prophetic dreams were indeed literal rather than symbolic, then they were traveling toward the very location where tragedy would unfold. Yet she could not bring herself to voice these concerns, trained as she had been to trust her mother's judgment in all matters relating to their extraordinary gifts. The journey through the Scottish countryside revealed a world that Rowena had glimpsed only through visions and scholarly texts. Here was the reality behind the prophecies. Villages struggling to survive in an age where magical and mundane violence were equally common. Families torn apart by conflicts they could neither understand nor escape. The tower that had sheltered her childhood suddenly seemed less like protection and more like prison, cutting her off from experiences that might have prepared her for the complexities of actual human suffering. Morgana rode in silence, her attention divided between the physical demands of travel and the prophetic impressions that guided their route toward those most in need of aid. Her face bore the concentrated expression that Rowena recognized as indication of active sight, suggesting that she too was receiving visions of what lay ahead. If these glimpses included warnings of danger, she gave no sign, maintaining the stoic composure that had defined her approach to both prophecy and healing throughout her extraordinary career. The battlefield they discovered upon arrival was worse than any vision could have prepared them for. Here was human suffering in its rawest form, stripped of the romantic notions that ballads and stories used to make violence palatable. The dead lay scattered across muddy ground that had been trampled by horses and soaked with blood until it more closely resembled a slaughterhouse than a place where living men had fought for causes they believed were worth dying for. Yet it was not the carnage that stopped Rowena's breath in her throat, but the field of flowers that surrounded the killing ground like a border between life and death. White soapwort bloomed in impossible profusion, their pale petals luminous in the afternoon sun, swaying in breezes that seemed to carry whispers of approaching doom. The vision that had haunted her dreams was unfolding before her eyes, with literal accuracy that left no room for symbolic interpretation. The survivors huddled in whatever shelter they could find, too injured to move far from the battlefield, but too afraid to remain in the open where scavengers both human and animal might discover them. Their wounds were terrible to behold, inflicted by weapons designed to cause maximum suffering rather than clean death. Many would die without magical intervention, while others might survive but carry disabilities that would mark them for the rest of their shortened lives. Morgana approached the work of healing with the same methodical precision that characterized all her endeavors. Each patient was assessed not just for visible injuries but for magical damage that ordinary healers might miss, trauma that extended beyond the physical into realms where only seer's sight could penetrate. Her methods were efficient but not unkind, tempered by understanding that suffering served purposes that mere comfort could not address. Rowena watched her mother work with fascination and growing dread, recognizing techniques that had been described in theoretical terms during her education, but never demonstrated with such deadly seriousness. This was healing magic at its most advanced level, requiring not just knowledge of anatomy and magical theory, but intuitive understanding of the connections between body, mind, and spirit that bound all conscious beings together in webs of cause and effect. But it was while observing these healing procedures that the next elements of her prophetic vision began to manifest. Among the wounded was a woman whose screams of agony rose above the general moaning of the injured, a voice filled with such desperate anguish that it seemed to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. The sound was exactly what Rowena had heard in her dreams, confirming beyond all doubt that her recurring nightmare was playing out in literal detail before her eyes. The implications of this recognition were staggering. If the flowers and screams were proving accurate, then the blood she had seen spreading across white petals was not symbolic but actual, not metaphorical but terrifyingly real. Someone was going to die on this field of soapwort, and given the pattern of her visions, that someone was likely to be connected to her personally in ways that would make the loss devastating. Her first instinct was to warn her mother immediately, to share the full details of her prophetic dreams, and convince Morgana to leave the battlefield before tragedy could strike. But years of training had taught her to evaluate visions carefully before acting on their implications. to distinguish between fate that could be changed and destiny that must be accepted. The very clarity of her recurring nightmare suggested the latter, events so firmly fixed in the streams of possibility that attempting to alter them might only ensure their fulfillment. Yet as she watched her mother move among the wounded, Rowena felt certainty crystallizing in her mind like ice forming on still water. The woman in her visions had always been hidden in shadow, her identity concealed by prophetic symbolism that protected seers from knowledge too terrible to bear. But now, surrounded by the literal fulfillment of every other element in her dreams, she understood with awful clarity who that woman must be. The tragedy was not approaching. It was already here, unfolding around them with the inexorable momentum of a landslide that had been building for years. Every choice that had led them to this place, every decision that had shaped their journey, had been guided by forces larger than individual will or desire. They were players in a drama that had been written by fate itself, actors speaking lines that had been composed by destiny and rehearsed through generations of prophetic dreams. The argument that erupted between mother and daughter began with Rowena's desperate attempt to convince Morgana to leave immediately. She spoke of dangers that she could sense but not articulate, of wrongness that hung in the air like poison gas, of futures that would unfold with terrible consequences if they remained in this place of blood and flowers. Her words were urgent but necessarily vague, for the full truth of her visions was too terrible to speak aloud. Morgana's response was predictably harsh, shaped by years of training that had taught both of them to value duty above personal safety. They had come to heal the wounded, and that work would continue until it was complete or circumstances made it impossible. The Ravenclaw family had never abandoned those in need, regardless of personal cost or potential danger. If Rowena's visions were warning of genuine threats, then proper preparation was the answer, not cowardly flight that would leave innocent people to suffer and die. But beneath her mother's stern words, Rowena could hear something else. Fear that went beyond concern for the wounded and extended into realms that had nothing to do with healing or duty. Morgana's own prophetic abilities were showing her glimpses of approaching crisis, visions that she had not shared, but which clearly influenced her determination to complete their mission regardless of cost. She knew something was coming, some test or transformation that would require all her strength and skill to survive. The confrontation escalated as Rowena's desperation overcame the careful emotional control that years of training had instilled. She spoke of white flowers and screaming women, of blood spreading across petals like ink across parchment, of recurring nightmares that had haunted her sleep for months. The prophetic dreams poured out of her in a torrent of words that carried conviction born of absolute certainty, visions too vivid and consistent to be dismissed as products of an untrained mind. Yet even as she spoke, Rowena could see that her words were having the opposite effect from what she intended. Instead of convincing her mother to flee, the detailed description of prophetic visions seemed to harden Morgana's resolve to remain and complete their healing work. This was the test that the site had been preparing them for, the moment when all their training in emotional detachment and acceptance of fate would be put to ultimate proof. The magical confrontation that followed was unlike anything in their previous relationship, a clash not just of wills but of prophetic abilities turned against each other in desperate combat. Rowena's disillusionment charm was cast with power amplified by emotional desperation, charged with enough force to overcome her mother's considerable magical defenses through sheer overwhelming intensity. But the spell was shaped by panic rather than precision, love rather than logic, fear rather than the cold detachment that proper magical combat required. The result was catastrophic in ways that mere technique could never have achieved. Instead of simply disarming her mother as intended, the overpowered spell struck Morgana with force that lifted her from her feet and hurled her backward toward the cliff edge that bordered the healing ground. Time seemed to slow as Rowena watched her mother's body arc through the air, arms windmilling desperately for balance that could not be achieved, eyes wide with shock at this betrayal by the daughter she had trained to value control above all else. The fall itself was brief, but seemed to last forever, each moment stretched into agonizing clarity by Seer's perception that captured every detail with ruthless accuracy. Morgana's robes billowed around her like dark wings, her wand spun away to land among the white flowers. Her face showed not fear but something approaching understanding, as if she finally grasped the full meaning of visions that had been guiding her toward this moment for years. Rowena's descent to the cliff base was a nightmare of scrambling over loose rocks and thorny vegetation that tore at her robes and skin with equal indifference. Her mother lay motionless among the soapwort, surrounded by petals that were already beginning to show the first crimson stains that would complete the prophetic vision's terrible accuracy. The injuries were extensive and clearly fatal. Internal damage that even the most skilled healing magic could not address when the body's essential structures had been so completely disrupted. Yet Morgana clung to consciousness long enough to deliver the final lesson that would shape everything Rowena would become in the years ahead. Her voice was weak but clear, carrying wisdom distilled from a lifetime of dancing with prophetic forces too large for human comprehension. The words she spoke were not expressions of forgiveness or love, but practical instructions for survival, guidance that would enable her daughter to transform tragedy into strength and loss into wisdom. The advice was characteristically harsh and utterly essential. Rowena must become cold, detached, logical in all her dealings with others, viewing emotion as weakness and attachment as vulnerability that enemies could exploit. The future was not shown to seers so that it might be changed, but so that it could be accepted with the grace that came from understanding, rather than fighting against forces larger than individual will or desire. Most importantly, pain itself must be accepted as teacher rather than enemy, a source of wisdom that could not be gained through comfort or safety. The sight demanded prices that seemed unbearable to untrained minds. But those who learned to pay such costs without complaint would find themselves possessed of abilities that transcended normal human limitations. Strength came not from avoiding suffering, but from transforming it into knowledge that could serve purposes larger than personal happiness. The blood that spread across the white soapwort petals as Morgana's life ebbed away was exactly what Rowena had seen in her visions, confirming the literal accuracy of prophecy while simultaneously revealing its true purpose. The recurring nightmares had not been warnings meant to prevent tragedy, but preparation designed to help her survive it, psychological conditioning that would enable her to function despite losses that would have shattered someone less thoroughly educated in the harsh realities of prophetic existence. As her mother's breathing stopped and the terrible stillness of death settled over the flower-strewn ground, Rowena felt something fundamental shift within her own soul. The last connections to childhood innocence and emotional spontaneity were severed as cleanly as if cut by a blade, replaced by the cold clarity that would define her character for the rest of her extraordinary life. She had become what her education had always intended, a weapon forged from tragedy and tempered by loss, shaped into something that could function in a world where sentiment was luxury and attachment was weakness. The other healers found her there hours later, kneeling beside her mother's body, among flowers that were now thoroughly stained with prophetic fulfillment. They offered comfort that she did not need, and sympathy that she could not accept. understanding that something essential had changed in ways that went far beyond simple bereavement. The girl who had accompanied Morgana to the battlefield was gone forever, replaced by someone whose eyes held depths that seemed far older than her actual years. The journey back to the tower was conducted in silence that felt sacred rather than empty, weighted with understanding that extended beyond words into realms where only shared experience could provide adequate communication. Rowena carried her mother's body with magic that was stronger and more controlled than any she had previously managed, as if tragedy had unlocked abilities that normal development could never have accessed. The burial was conducted according to ancient Ravenclaw traditions that had been established by seers who understood death as transformation rather than ending. Morgana was laid to rest in the tower's crypts, alongside generations of her predecessors, women who had paid similar prices for similar gifts and found ways to transform suffering into service. The ceremonies were brief but profound, acknowledging that those who dealt with eternal verities had little need for elaborate ritual or extended mourning. But it was in the days that followed her mother's funeral that Rowena truly understood the full scope of how completely her life had changed. The tower that had been her childhood home now felt like a prison, filled with memories, too painful to bear, but too precious to abandon. Every room held echoes of lessons learned through harsh necessity. Every corridor whispered with voices that could no longer provide guidance or comfort. The decision to leave came not from running away, but from recognition that her education was complete, and the next phase of her destiny lay beyond the walls that had shaped her childhood. She was no longer a student learning to control dangerous abilities, but a master whose gifts had been perfected through trial by fire and tempered by loss into instruments of precision and power. The tower would endure without her, its ancient magic sustained by forces that transcended individual presence or absence. Her departure was conducted with the same methodical preparation that had characterized every aspect of her upbringing. Personal possessions were sorted according to utility and significance, with sentiment ruthlessly eliminated from consideration. Books that contained essential knowledge were packed alongside artifacts that enhanced her natural abilities, while items that carried only emotional value were left behind as offerings to the ghosts of childhood that would never again influence her choices. The last act before leaving was the most significant: acceptance of the prophetic vision that had guided her toward this transformation. Standing in the garden where soapwort still bloomed with innocent beauty, Rowena acknowledged that her mother's death had been not accident but destiny, not tragedy but necessity that served purposes larger than personal loss or grief. The sight had shown her the future not so that it could be changed, but so that she could be prepared to survive it and learn from it. As she walked away from the tower that had been her entire world, Rowena carried with her not just magical abilities of extraordinary power, but understanding of the prices that such abilities demanded. She was no longer simply a seer, but something approaching a force of nature, shaped by prophecy and loss into an instrument that could serve purposes that normal human compassion would find unbearable. The future stretched before her like an uncharted territory filled with possibilities that her enhanced perception could glimpse but not fully comprehend. She would meet others like herself, brilliant individuals whose destinies were intertwined with her own, in patterns too complex for casual understanding. Together they would create something unprecedented in magical history, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. But all of that lay ahead, beyond horizons that even Seer's sight could not fully penetrate. For now, she was simply a young woman walking away from her past toward a destiny that would demand everything she had to give, and more than she had ever imagined she possessed. The dance with fate had begun in earnest, and like all such dances, it would end in ways that even the most gifted prophets could never fully foresee. The road that led away from the Ravenclaw Tower stretched into distance that held promises and perils in equal measure. Rowena walked it with steps that carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled, and the lightness of spirit that came from complete acceptance of whatever destiny might yet demand. She had been forged in the fires of necessity and emerged as something harder and more valuable than she had been before. A tool that fate itself could wield in service of purposes too vast for individual comprehension. The roads that wound through the mist-shrouded highlands of ancient Britain were treacherous paths that tested both courage and wisdom, carved by centuries of travelers who had sought knowledge in distant places and paid prices that could not be measured in mere coin or comfort. It was along these forgotten ways that Rowena Ravenclaw began her pilgrimage, carrying nothing but her enhanced abilities and the hard-won understanding that true education could only be found through experience that challenged every assumption about the nature of magic and reality itself. The transformation that had begun with her mother's death continued to unfold with each mile she traveled, reshaping not just her magical abilities but her fundamental approach to existence itself. The emotional detachment that Morgana had demanded was no longer conscious effort but natural state, a armor of clarity that protected her from the kind of sentimental weakness that could compromise the objectivity essential for advanced prophetic work. Yet beneath this cold exterior, something deeper was taking shape, a determination to use her extraordinary gifts in service of purposes that transcended personal ambition or individual survival. The Britain she discovered beyond the tower's protective walls was a land caught between ages, where ancient magic still flowed through sacred groves and stone circles, while new forms of power emerged from the collision between different magical traditions brought by successive waves of conquest and settlement. Celtic druids maintained their woodland sanctuaries alongside Saxon rune workers and Norse Seder practitioners, each group guarding secrets that had been refined through generations of careful study and dangerous experimentation. Her first months of travel were spent in systematic exploration of these diverse magical communities, approaching each encounter with the methodical precision that characterized all her endeavors. She studied under hedge witches who brewed potions from plants that grew only in places where blood had been spilled, learned from hermit wizards who had spent decades perfecting techniques for scrying through crystal and flame, absorbed lessons from traveling scholars who carried libraries worth of knowledge in magically enhanced memories that could preserve information for centuries without degradation. But it was the training she received from ancient seers, dwelling in remote caves and hidden valleys, that truly advanced her understanding of prophetic arts. These were practitioners who had pushed the boundaries of temporal perception far beyond anything her mother's education had encompassed, developing techniques that allowed consciousness to drift through layers of possibility like smoke through air. Under their harsh tutelage, Rowena learned to distinguish between the countless futures that radiated from every present moment, identifying those that carried the weight of inevitability and those that remained malleable enough to be influenced by informed action. The exercises were grueling and often dangerous, requiring her to project her awareness across vast distances in time while maintaining enough anchor in the present to avoid being lost in the labyrinthine pathways that connected all possible outcomes. She learned to read the magical signatures that surrounded every person, seeing not just their current intentions but the potential destinies that could unfold from their choices. Most challengingly, she mastered the art of prophetic interpretation, understanding when visions were meant to be taken literally and when they served as symbolic representations of deeper truths. These abilities came with prices that went far beyond the physical exhaustion that followed intensive magical work. Each expansion of her prophetic range made normal human interaction more difficult, as she found herself seeing potential futures in every face she encountered, understanding the tragic outcomes that might result from seemingly innocent choices. The emotional detachment that had once been conscious discipline became psychological necessity, the only way to function while carrying knowledge of sorrows that had not yet occurred but inevitably would. It was during this period of intensive study that she began to develop the philosophical framework that would later guide her approach to education and magical practice. Knowledge, she came to understand, was not merely accumulation of facts, but transformation of perspective that allowed its possessor to function effectively despite awareness of truths that would paralyze untrained minds. Wisdom was not the absence of emotion, but its proper channeling in service of purposes larger than individual comfort or happiness. The months of solitary travel also provided time for reflection on her mother's final teachings, allowing her to understand how tragedy had been deliberately incorporated into her education as preparation for responsibilities she had not yet fully grasped. Every harsh lesson, every moment of enforced emotional distance, every exercise in accepting, rather than fighting against prophetic visions, had been designed to create someone capable of bearing burdens that would crush spirits less thoroughly prepared. Yet for all the value of such preparation, Rowena began to recognize limitations in the purely intellectual approach to magic that had defined her upbringing. Knowledge without application remained merely academic exercise. Wisdom without connection to living experience became cold abstraction that served no purpose beyond its own accumulation. The sight that had cost her so much to develop needed grounding in practical reality if it was to serve purposes worthy of the prices that had been paid for its acquisition. It was this recognition that led her to seek out practitioners who combined prophetic abilities with active engagement in the wider magical world, seers who used their gifts not for contemplative withdrawal, but for concrete service to their communities. She found them working as healers who could anticipate complications before they manifested, as teachers who understood which students possessed potential that conventional assessment might miss, as advisors who helped leaders navigate complex political situations through understanding of long-term consequences that normal counsel could not provide. These encounters began to reshape her understanding of what her own destiny might hold, suggesting possibilities that extended far beyond the isolated existence that her education had seemed to prepare her for. The abilities that had cost her childhood and family might serve purposes that justified such sacrifices, but only if she could find ways to apply them that transcended mere personal survival or academic achievement. The winter of her 15th year brought her to the borderlands between Saxon and Celtic territories, where political tensions created opportunities for those willing to serve as intermediaries between communities that shared magical traditions despite their mundane conflicts. Here she encountered for the first time practitioners who combined multiple magical disciplines in ways that amplified their individual effectiveness, healers who enhanced their arts with prophetic insight, warriors who strengthened their combat abilities through runic magic, scholars who preserved knowledge through techniques that drew from diverse cultural sources. It was in this environment of cross-cultural magical exchange that Rowena first encountered Helga Hufflepuff, though neither could have predicted the significance of that meeting at the time. The young woman who would become her closest friend appeared initially as merely another traveling healer, distinguished mainly by her unusual warmth in dealing with patients who had good reason to distrust magical practitioners. Where other healers maintained professional distance to protect themselves from emotional contamination, Helga seemed to draw strength from the connections she formed with those she served. The contrast with Rowena's own approach to magic could hardly have been more pronounced. Where Rowena had been trained to value detachment above engagement, analysis above intuition, control above spontaneity, Helga embodied a philosophy that treated magic as expression of fundamental interconnectedness rather than tool for individual advancement. Her healing techniques were enhanced by genuine empathy that allowed her to understand her patient's suffering from within rather than observing it from clinical remove. Yet despite these philosophical differences, or perhaps because of them, the two young women found themselves drawn into conversations that continued long into the night around campfires that seemed to burn brighter in response to the magical resonance between their contrasting approaches to their shared gifts. Helga's questions challenged assumptions that Rowena had never thought to examine, while Rowena's analytical insights provided frameworks that helped Helga understand why her intuitive methods proved so consistently effective. The friendship that developed between them was unlike anything in Rowena's previous experience, representing the first relationship based on intellectual respect rather than hierarchical duty or mutual utility. Helga neither feared her prophetic abilities nor sought to exploit them for personal advantage, instead treating them as natural expressions of a mind that had been shaped by circumstances requiring unusual adaptation. For the first time since her mother's death, Rowena found herself in the company of someone who valued her for qualities beyond mere magical power or tactical utility. Helga's influence began to soften some of the harsh edges that tragedy had carved into Rowena's character, not through direct challenge to her defensive mechanisms, but through consistent demonstration of alternative approaches that achieved comparable results through different means. Where Rowena relied on prophetic insight to anticipate problems before they manifested, Helga used empathic connection to understand needs before they were articulated. Where Rowena approached magical challenges through systematic analysis and careful planning, Helga trusted intuitive responses that seemed to emerge from sources deeper than conscious thought. The collaboration that emerged from their friendship proved more effective than either could have achieved alone, combining prophetic foresight with healing intuition in ways that addressed both immediate symptoms and underlying causes of the problems they encountered. Their reputation began to spread throughout the region as practitioners whose methods, though unconventional, produced results that exceeded anything available through more traditional approaches to magical healing and counseling. But perhaps more importantly for Rowena's long-term development, Helga's friendship provided the first positive model for emotional connection that she had encountered since childhood. The warmth that radiated from her companion was not weakness, but strength, not vulnerability, but power that could transform even the most difficult situations through patient application of compassion guided by wisdom. Love, properly understood and carefully applied, could be a tool as precise and effective as any other form of magic. The months they spent traveling together became a masterclass in the practical applications of theoretical knowledge, as Rowena learned to ground her prophetic insights in concrete reality, while helping Helga develop analytical frameworks that enhanced her natural empathic abilities. They complemented each other perfectly, balancing strengths and compensating for limitations in ways that made both more effective than they had been separately. It was during this period of collaborative growth that Rowena came into possession of the artifact that would become her most recognizable symbol and ultimately her greatest temptation. The diadem was discovered in the ruins of an ancient temple dedicated to deities whose names had been forgotten but whose power still lingered in places where proper rituals had been conducted for centuries. The artifact itself was beautiful beyond mere craftsmanship, its sapphire centerpiece seeming to hold depths that reflected not just light, but understanding itself. The moment her fingers touched the circlet, Rowena felt resonance that suggested compatibility between the artifact's inherent properties and her own enhanced abilities. The diadem had been crafted specifically to amplify intellectual functions, strengthening memory, sharpening analytical capabilities, and most intriguingly, enhancing the kind of pattern recognition that made advanced prophetic work possible. Here was a tool that could augment her natural gifts in ways that would multiply their effectiveness exponentially. But Helga's reaction to the discovery was characteristically cautious, reflecting her healer's understanding of how magical enhancement could become dependency that weakened the very abilities it was meant to strengthen. Artifacts that promised to amplify natural talents often created users who became unable to function without their artificial assistance, losing touch with the organic development that true mastery required. The diadem might enhance Rowena's intellect, but at what cost to her natural wisdom? The debate that ensued revealed fundamental philosophical differences that would influence both their individual destinies and their eventual collaborative efforts. Rowena argued that tools were morally neutral, their value determined entirely by the purposes for which they were employed. An artifact that could enhance her ability to see patterns and understand connections would allow her to serve others more effectively, multiplying the good that her natural abilities could accomplish. Refusing such enhancement out of abstract principle would be selfishness disguised as virtue. Helga countered that magic itself was relationship rather than mere technique, dependent on authentic connection between practitioner and power, rather than artificial amplification that created barriers between user and source. The diadem might make Rowena more intellectually capable, but it could also distance her from the intuitive understanding that made wisdom possible. Enhancement without integration risked creating knowledge without judgment, analysis without empathy. The resolution came through characteristic compromise that reflected both their individual natures and the strength of their friendship. Rowena would claim the diadem and explore its properties, but under Helga's careful observation, and with commitment to abandoning the artifact if its influence proved problematic. The enhancement would be tool rather than crutch, augmentation rather than replacement for her natural abilities. The early experiments with the diadem's power proved intoxicating in ways that validated both positions in their philosophical debate. Wearing the artifact, Rowena found her already considerable intellect sharpened to levels that seemed to approach omniscience within specific domains of knowledge. Complex problems that had previously required hours of careful analysis became transparently clear within minutes of focused attention. Prophetic visions that had been fragmentary and difficult to interpret revealed their meanings with crystalline clarity. Yet alongside these benefits came subtle changes that concerned both young women, though neither could initially articulate the nature of their unease. The enhanced intellectual clarity seemed to come at the cost of emotional nuance, making Rowena more decisive, but less patient with those whose thinking moved at normal human speeds. The prophetic insights became more accurate, but also more deterministic, emphasizing inevitability rather than possibility, in ways that could become paralyzing rather than empowering. Helga's gentle questioning helped Rowena recognize these problematic patterns before they became entrenched habits, leading to modifications in how she employed the diadem's power that preserved its benefits while minimizing its potential for psychological corruption. The artifact became a tool to be used judiciously rather than constantly, enhancement for specific challenges rather than general augmentation of her natural capabilities. The discipline required to use such powerful enhancement responsibly became another element in Rowena's education, teaching lessons about the relationship between power and restraint that would prove essential for the responsibilities she would eventually assume. True mastery lay not in maximizing one's capabilities, but in understanding when and how to apply them most effectively, recognizing that greater power demanded greater wisdom in its application. The reputation that emerged from their collaborative efforts began to attract attention from practitioners whose own abilities and ambitions matched their growing influence within the magical communities they served. Word spread of two young women whose combined talents could address problems that had defeated more experienced practitioners, who brought both prophetic insight and healing wisdom to challenges that required understanding of human nature as well as technical, magical expertise. It was this growing reputation that would eventually bring them to the attention of others whose destinies were intertwined with their own, setting in motion the collaborations that would reshape magical education throughout the British Isles. But those meetings lay in the future, beyond horizons that even enhanced prophetic sight could not fully penetrate. For now, they were simply two friends discovering that their individual gifts could be multiplied through partnership based on mutual respect and complementary strengths. The friendship between Rowena and Helga represented something unprecedented in both their experiences, a relationship that enhanced rather than diminished their individual capabilities, that provided emotional sustenance without compromising their dedication to service, that offered companionship without requiring sacrifice of the intellectual integrity that defined their approach to magical practice. They had found in each other the perfect balance between mind and heart, analysis and intuition, wisdom and compassion. As they continued their travels through the diverse magical communities of ancient Britain, both young women understood that they were being prepared for purposes that extended far beyond their current activities. The knowledge they were accumulating, the skills they were developing, the philosophical frameworks they were refining through debate and practical application. All of these were building towards some greater destiny that their combined talents would be uniquely qualified to serve. The seeds of what would become Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry were already being planted in conversations around campfires and in letters exchanged with other practitioners, whose vision extended beyond immediate problems toward systemic solutions that could benefit entire generations of magical practitioners. Education, they were beginning to understand, might be the key to transforming individual excellence into collective advancement that could elevate the entire magical community. But such grand purposes remained theoretical possibilities rather than concrete plans. Ideas that excited their imaginations without yet demanding the sacrifices that their implementation would ultimately require. The future stretched before them, filled with potential that seemed unlimited by anything except their own vision and dedication. They were young, brilliant, and possessed of abilities that were already reshaping their understanding of what magic could accomplish when properly understood and skillfully applied. The roads that had carried Rowena away from the tragedy of her childhood were now carrying both young women toward destinies that would test every lesson they had learned and demand capabilities they had not yet fully developed. The dance with fate continued, its steps becoming more complex as additional partners joined the performance, its music growing richer as individual melodies combined into harmonies that no single voice could have created alone. The autumn mists that cloaked the ancient pathways between Saxon settlements carried more than moisture from distant seas. They bore whispers of violence that spoke to those whose ears had been trained to hear the deeper currents of human conflict. It was along one such fog-shrouded road that Rowena and Helga encountered their first glimpse of true heroism in action, though neither could have predicted how profoundly that meeting would reshape their understanding of courage, leadership, and the complex moral calculations that governed life in an age where justice was earned through strength rather than granted through law. The sounds reached them first, the clash of steel against steel, the desperate shouts of men pushed beyond their limits, the inhuman roars of creatures that should not have existed in daylight hours yet prowled the borderlands where civilization's grip grew weak. Through the swirling grey vapours emerged a scene that might have stepped from the darkest of bardic tales, where a single figure stood against odds that would have sent lesser souls fleeing toward whatever dubious safety distance might provide. Godric Gryffindor fought with a combination of magical power and martial skill that transformed combat into something approaching art. his sword weaving patterns of light through the air while his wand channeled forces that made the very ground beneath his feet tremble with accumulated energy. But it was not his technique that marked him as extraordinary so much as his absolute commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves, a dedication so complete that personal survival seemed secondary to the larger purpose that drove his every action. The enemies he faced were not ordinary bandits seeking easy profit, but practitioners of the darkest magical arts, wizards who had chosen to serve powers that existed beyond the normal boundaries of human understanding. Their spells carried corruption that lingered in the air like poison, creating zones of spiritual contamination where ordinary magic faltered and conventional courage proved insufficient. They fought not merely to win, but to spread the kind of despair that could infect entire communities with hopelessness that transcended rational fear. Yet Godric stood against them with unwavering resolve, his magic blazing with purity that seemed to cleanse the very atmosphere around him. Each spell he cast was an act of affirmation rather than mere destruction, asserting principles of justice and protection that gave his power weight beyond its technical capabilities. This was magic wielded not for personal advancement, but in service of ideals that transformed individual action into something approaching divine purpose. Rowena watched the battle unfold with the analytical precision that had become second nature, her enhanced perception, allowing her to read the tactical situation with accuracy that revealed both its immediate dynamics and its likely outcomes. Godric was skilled beyond question, his combination of magical and martial abilities exceeding anything she had previously witnessed, but he was vastly outnumbered by enemies whose coordination suggested extensive planning and preparation. The prophetic insights that flickered through her consciousness painted pictures of possible futures that ranged from triumph to tragedy, their relative probabilities shifting with each exchange of spells and sword strokes. Victory was possible, but would require intervention that could tip the balance in favor of justice over corruption, light over darkness, protection over predation. The question was whether such intervention would serve larger purposes or merely postpone inevitable conflicts that might be better faced under different circumstances. But it was Helga's immediate response that ultimately determined their course of action, her healer's instincts overriding strategic calculation as she witnessed suffering that demanded attention regardless of its tactical implications. The villagers cowering behind inadequate shelter were not pawns in some larger game, but human beings whose pain was immediate and real, whose need for protection transcended abstract considerations of optimal timing or resource allocation. The combined intervention of both young women transformed the battle's dynamics in ways that none of the original participants could have anticipated. Where individual excellence had proven insufficient against coordinated malevolence, collaborative effort created opportunities that single-handed heroism could not achieve. Helga's healing magic sustained Godric's strength, while her empathic abilities provided intelligence about enemy intentions that conventional observation might have missed. Rowena's contribution was more subtle, but equally decisive, her prophetic insights allowing her to anticipate the Dark Wizard's tactical adaptations, while her enhanced analytical capabilities identified weaknesses in their coordination that could be exploited through precisely timed interventions. But most importantly, her presence provided psychological pressure that disrupted their confidence, introducing variables into their calculations that made their carefully laid plans suddenly unreliable. Yet it was not superior firepower or tactical advantage that ultimately ended the conflict, but something far more profound: Rowena's recognition that these particular enemies could be defeated through psychological warfare rather than direct magical combat. Her prophetic abilities, enhanced by the diadem's influence, allowed her to see not just what might happen, but what these specific individuals feared most deeply, the threats that could paralyze their will to fight more effectively than any spell. The prophecy she delivered was a masterpiece of calculated ambiguity, combining genuine prescient insight with theatrical presentation in ways that left her enemies uncertain whether they faced supernatural revelation or sophisticated bluff. Her words carried the weight of absolute conviction, while remaining vague enough to allow their own fears to fill in details that would make the threats personally meaningful to each listener. Whether the visions she described were authentic glimpses of future consequences or carefully crafted psychological manipulation remained unclear even to Helga, who had learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished her friend's genuine prophetic episodes from her conscious strategic calculations. The ambiguity was itself part of the weapon's effectiveness, creating doubt that made resistance seem futile regardless of the prophecy's literal accuracy. The immediate result exceeded even Rowena's expectations, as the Dark Wizard's coordination collapsed under the pressure of individual fear that overrode their collective commitment to their malevolent cause. Bandits who had seemed willing to die for their corrupt ideals suddenly discovered personal survival was more important than abstract loyalty to powers that might or might not protect them from the consequences of their choices. Their retreat was chaotic and complete, abandoning not just the immediate battlefield, but the entire region, as they sought distance from someone whose prophetic abilities might make future ambushes impossible to execute successfully. Word would spread through the networks that connected practitioners of dark arts, marking Rowena as a threat whose reputation alone might serve as protection for communities lucky enough to earn her attention. The aftermath of the battle provided the first opportunity for extended conversation between the three young practitioners whose destinies were now beginning to interweave in patterns too complex for casual observation. Around a fire that seemed to burn more brightly than natural fuel could account for, they shared stories that revealed backgrounds as different as their magical specializations, yet united by common dedication to principles that transcended personal ambition or individual survival. Godric's approach to magic was the most straightforward of the three, shaped by military traditions that valued direct action over subtle manipulation, courage over cunning, protection of the innocent over strategic calculation. His family had produced warriors for generations, each one dedicated to the proposition that those blessed with superior abilities bore corresponding obligations to defend those less fortunately gifted. Yet, beneath his apparent simplicity lay philosophical sophistication that recognized courage as moral choice rather than mere absence of fear, justice as principle that required constant vigilance rather than abstract ideal that could be taken for granted. His willingness to face overwhelming odds alone reflected not reckless bravado but calculated assessment that some battles were worth fighting regardless of their probable outcomes. Helga's background was similarly grounded in service, but expressed through healing rather than warfare, shaped by family traditions that viewed magic as fundamentally connective force that bound all living things together in webs of mutual responsibility. Her empathic abilities were not accidents of birth, but products of training that emphasized understanding over judgment, compassion over detachment, healing over harm. Her philosophical framework treated individual suffering as collective failure, believing that communities bore responsibility for the welfare of all their members, and that those with abilities to address problems were morally obligated to do so regardless of personal cost or inconvenience. Magic was gift that created obligations rather than privileges, power that demanded service rather than enabling domination. Rowena's own background, when she chose to share it, revealed the harshest education of the three, but also the most systematic preparation for the kind of responsibilities that superior abilities inevitably created. Her prophetic training had taught her to think in terms of long-term consequences rather than immediate gratification, to value wisdom over comfort, to accept painful truths rather than comfortable illusions. The philosophical debate that emerged from these different perspectives continued throughout the night and would, in various forms, define their relationship for years to come. Each brought valid insights shaped by authentic experience, yet each also carried blind spots that the other's perspectives could illuminate and potentially correct through patient discussion and practical collaboration. Godric's courage, admirable though it was, sometimes led him into confrontations that better preparation might have avoided entirely, creating unnecessary risks for both himself and those he sought to protect. His directness, while refreshing in its honesty, occasionally missed subtleties that more nuanced approaches might have addressed more effectively. Helga's compassion, essential though it was for her healing work, sometimes prevented her from recognizing when mercy might enable, rather than cure the problems she encountered. Her empathic abilities, powerful though they were for understanding individual suffering, could become overwhelming when applied to conflicts involving large numbers of people with incompatible needs and interests. Rowena's analytical capabilities, invaluable though they were for understanding complex situations, sometimes led to paralysis through excessive consideration of variables that might never actually influence outcomes. Her emotional detachment, necessary though it was for processing prophetic information objectively, could make her seem cold or uncaring to those who needed reassurance as much as accurate assessment. Yet, when their different approaches were combined through genuine collaboration rather than competitive assertion, the results exceeded what any individual effort could have achieved. Godric's courage provided the will to act on insights that analysis alone might never have translated into practical intervention. Helga's compassion ensured that their efforts remained focused on genuinely helping people rather than pursuing abstract ideals that served no concrete purpose. Rowena's wisdom helped them avoid mistakes that good intentions alone could not prevent. The recognition of these complementary strengths sparked discussions that would ultimately reshape their individual approaches to magic and their collective understanding of what properly coordinated effort might accomplish. Each began to see possibilities that their individual perspectives had missed, opportunities for service that required capabilities no single practitioner possessed, but that collaborative effort might make feasible. The idea that would eventually become Hogwarts emerged from these nighttime conversations, not as sudden inspiration, but as gradual recognition of systematic problems that systematic solutions might address. The magical communities they had encountered during their travels were rich in individual talent, but poor in institutional structures that could preserve knowledge across generations or coordinate efforts toward common purposes. Young magical practitioners learned through apprenticeship systems that were highly dependent on finding masters whose abilities matched their needs and whose personalities proved compatible with extended close association. The results were inconsistent at best, with many potential talents never reaching full development due to inadequate instruction or mismatched educational approaches. More troubling was the isolation that characterized most advanced magical practice, as individuals with extraordinary abilities often found themselves cut off from peers who could understand their challenges or provide the kind of intellectual stimulation that prevented stagnation. The loneliness that had marked each of their backgrounds was apparently common among those whose gifts set them apart from ordinary magical practitioners. The solution that began to take shape through their discussions was unprecedented in its scope and ambition. A permanent institution dedicated to magical education that could provide systematic instruction to young practitioners, while bringing together adult masters whose collaboration could advance the art itself. Such a school would require resources beyond what any individual could provide, but the benefits it could offer might justify whatever sacrifices its establishment would demand. Yet, even as they discussed these grand possibilities, none of them fully grasped how completely such an undertaking would reshape their lives, or what prices it would eventually demand from each of them. The enthusiasm that drove their conversations was infectious, but also naive, based on optimistic assumptions about human nature that their future experiences would severely test. The morning after their first meeting brought practical considerations that temporarily displaced theoretical discussions about educational reform and systematic approaches to magical advancement. The village that Godric had defended needed immediate assistance that their combined abilities could provide, while the Dark Wizard's retreat created opportunities for pursuing intelligence that might prevent future attacks on other vulnerable communities. Their collaboration during these immediate tasks provided practical education in how their different approaches could be integrated most effectively, lessons that would prove invaluable when they eventually undertook the far more complex challenge of establishing an institution that could serve hundreds of students with diverse needs and abilities. Helga's healing work was enhanced by Rowena's ability to anticipate complications before they became life-threatening, and by Godric's willingness to accept personal risks that allowed access to patients in dangerous locations. Godric's protective efforts were strengthened by intelligence that Rowena's prophetic abilities could provide, and by healing support that allowed him to continue functioning, despite injuries that would normally require extended recovery periods. Rowena's analytical work was grounded in reality through Helga's empathic insights about individual motivations and through Godric's practical understanding of how conflicts actually developed rather than how theoretical models suggested they should unfold. Each contributed essential elements that the others could not provide, creating synergistic effects that multiplied their individual capabilities. The weeks they spent together, addressing the aftermath of the bandit attack, provided intensive education in collaborative magic that none of them could have gained through individual study or traditional apprenticeship. They learned to coordinate their efforts so seamlessly that their combined actions seemed like single organism with multiple specialized capabilities rather than three separate individuals working toward common goals. But perhaps more importantly, they learned to trust each other in ways that went beyond mere professional respect to approach the kind of deep friendship that could survive the stresses that ambitious undertakings inevitably created. Each proved worthy of the confidence the others placed in them, demonstrating reliability that encouraged increasingly complex collaborative efforts. The reputation that emerged from their joint activities began to attract attention from throughout the region, drawing other talented practitioners who were intrigued by reports of cooperative methods that achieved results exceeding what individual excellence could accomplish. Some came seeking instruction, others offering partnership. Still others simply curious about innovations that challenged traditional assumptions about how magical practice should be organized. It was among these visitors that they first encountered the individual who would complete their partnership and provide the final element necessary for their grand educational vision to become practical reality. Salazar Slytherin arrived not as supplicant seeking aid or student requesting instruction, but as equal whose own achievements had earned him reputation that matched their growing influence. His initial presentation suggested someone whose background and abilities complemented their existing partnership, while adding capabilities that none of them possessed individually. His mastery of certain magical arts was unquestioned. His intelligence was clearly exceptional, and his dedication to advancing magical knowledge seemed to match their own commitment to systematic improvement of educational opportunities. Yet there were aspects of his character and approach that created subtle tensions from the beginning, philosophical differences that would prove more significant than any of them initially recognized. Where they had learned to value collaboration over individual achievement, he maintained competitive instincts that treated partnerships as temporary alliances rather than permanent bonds. His vision for magical education, while sharing their commitment to systematic improvement over current haphazard arrangements, emphasized different priorities that would eventually create conflicts requiring resolution through means that would test all their ideals about cooperation and mutual respect. But such challenges lay in the future, beyond horizons that even prophetic sight could not fully penetrate. For now, they were simply four exceptional individuals whose meeting seemed guided by forces larger than mere coincidence, whose combined abilities promised achievements that could benefit entire generations of magical practitioners. The pieces necessary for their greatest accomplishment were finally assembled, though none of them yet understood how completely that accomplishment would reshape their lives, or what sacrifices its maintenance would ultimately demand from each of them. The future stretched before them, filled with possibilities that seemed limited only by their own vision and dedication. Opportunities to create something unprecedented in magical history that could serve purposes worthy of the prices they had already paid and the greater costs that destiny would eventually demand. The dance with fate continued, its steps becoming more complex as additional partners joined the performance, its music growing richer as individual melodies combined into harmonies that no single voice could have created alone. The vision came to Rowena on a night when the autumn stars wheeled overhead in patterns that seemed to spell out destinies in languages older than human speech, their cold light filtering through the canvas of her traveling shelter to illuminate dreams that carried the weight of absolute certainty. She found herself standing in a landscape that existed nowhere in her waking experience, yet felt more familiar than the tower where she had spent her childhood, as if this place had been waiting for her recognition across distances measured not in miles but in years of preparation and sacrifice. The creature that appeared in her prophetic sight was unlike anything from the bestiary scrolls that had filled her mother's library, yet its symbolic meaning was immediately clear to senses trained in the interpretation of visionary imagery. The boar was ancient beyond measure, its hide scarred by encounters with forces that had tested its strength without breaking its spirit, its tusks yellowed with age, but still capable of defending territory that it claimed through right of occupation rather than mere conquest. Most significantly, the boar bore upon its back the growths that would give their destined school its peculiar name, wart-like protrusions that spoke not of disease but of accumulated wisdom, knowledge that had been gained through experience too harsh for comfortable comprehension. Here was a symbol of learning that acknowledged truth rather than seeking comfort, education that transformed its recipients through trials that lesser institutions would carefully avoid. The beast moved through her vision with purposeful determination, following paths that wound through landscapes of increasing magical intensity, until it reached a promontory that overlooked waters of such crystalline purity that they seemed to hold reflections of every possibility that had ever existed or might yet come to pass. The location was perfect for their purposes, a place where ancient magic had pooled like wine in a cup, waiting for those with wisdom enough to recognize its potential and courage enough to claim it for worthy purposes. When Rowena woke from this prophetic dream, the images remained with her with the particular clarity that marked genuine foresight rather than mere wishful thinking. Every detail was preserved with perfect accuracy, from the texture of the boar's hide to the quality of light that reflected from the lake's surface, from the scent of highland flowers to the sound of wind moving through trees that had witnessed the passage of centuries, without losing their connection to the deep magic that flowed through the land itself. The urgency that accompanied true prophecy compelled immediate action, Though she understood that convincing her companions to undertake a journey based solely on visionary imagery would require careful presentation of evidence and logical argument. Godric's military background made him naturally suspicious of strategies based on supernatural insight rather than practical intelligence, while Helga's healer's training emphasized verified observation over theoretical possibility, and Salazar's scholarly approach demanded documentation that prophetic visions rarely provided. Yet when she described the vision to her three companions around their morning fire, the response exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Each recognized in her description elements that resonated with their own understanding of what their projected school would require, confirming through independent analysis what her prophetic sight had revealed through supernatural channels. The location she described possessed the qualities that systematic magical education would demand, while the symbolism of her vision suggested purposes that matched their emerging educational philosophy. Godric's immediate enthusiasm reflected his warrior's appreciation for defensible positions, and his recognition that the site Rowena described would provide natural protection against the kind of enemies their enterprise was certain to attract. A school that challenged traditional approaches to magical education would inevitably face opposition from those whose interests were served by maintaining current systems, making military considerations as important as academic ones. Helga's support was grounded in her healer's understanding of how environment influenced learning. Her recognition that students would thrive in surroundings that nurtured growth rather than simply containing activities. The connection to ancient magic that Rowena described would provide resources that conventional locations could not match, while the isolation would protect developing practitioners from distractions that could compromise their educational progress. Salazar's agreement was perhaps most significant because his scholarly background made him naturally skeptical of claims that could not be verified through established methods of investigation. Yet his own research into the history of magical education had identified geographical factors that correlated with successful institutions, and Rowena's description matched theoretical requirements that his studies had revealed as essential for advanced magical instruction. The journey to the location revealed in prophetic vision required weeks of careful travel through territories where magical and mundane conflicts created hazards that tested all their collaborative skills. The political situation throughout the British Isles remained fluid, with Saxon and Celtic communities maintaining uneasy truces that could collapse into violence with little warning, while practitioners of various magical traditions competed for resources and influence in ways that made neutral passage a complex negotiation. Yet their growing reputation preceded them, smoothing paths that might otherwise have required extensive diplomatic preparation or military force to navigate safely. Communities that had benefited from their previous interventions provided assistance that went beyond mere hospitality to include intelligence about conditions ahead and introduction to local practitioners whose cooperation could prove essential for completing their journey successfully. The collaborative nature of their travel provided intensive education in the practical challenges that their projected school would need to address, lessons that no amount of theoretical planning could have anticipated. Each member of their group brought different expertise to problems that required multiple approaches for effective resolution, demonstrating both the value of diverse capabilities and the complexity of coordinating such diversity toward common purposes. Godric's military training proved invaluable for route selection and security arrangements. His understanding of tactical considerations that could mean the difference between safe passage and dangerous confrontation. His ability to assess threats and organize responses provided foundation for group safety that allowed the others to focus on their specialized contributions without constant worry about immediate dangers. Helga's healing abilities were called upon repeatedly as they encountered communities struggling with problems that conventional remedies could not address, her empathic insights providing understanding of social dynamics that pure technical skill could not supply. Her gift for building trust with strangers made her their most effective ambassador in situations that required delicate negotiation rather than authoritative command. Rowena's prophetic insights guided their overall strategy, helping them avoid problems that conventional intelligence might not have detected while identifying opportunities that careful planning could not have anticipated. Her analytical capabilities allowed her to synthesize information from various sources into comprehensive understanding of complex situations that individual perspectives could not have grasped. Salazar's scholarly knowledge provided historical context that transformed isolated incidents into patterns that revealed underlying principles governing the challenges they encountered. His understanding of magical theory allowed him to devise solutions that drew upon resources and techniques that pure practical experience might have overlooked. The site they eventually discovered exceeded even Rowena's prophetic vision in its suitability for their educational purposes, though reaching it required navigating challenges that tested every skill they had developed during their individual and collaborative journeys. The location was protected not only by natural barriers, but by magical wards that had been established by previous inhabitants, whose identities were lost to history, but whose protective intentions remained active across centuries. The lake that dominated the landscape was fed by springs that emerged from depths where ancient magic had accumulated like sediment, creating waters that possessed properties beneficial to developing magical practitioners, while remaining harmful to those whose intentions carried malevolent purpose. The surrounding mountains provided natural barriers that would protect the school from casual intrusion, while offering resources that systematic magical education would require. Most importantly, the very air seemed charged with energies that enhanced magical learning, as if the location itself had been designed by forces that understood the requirements of advanced instruction better than mortal minds could comprehend. Students who studied in such an environment would have advantages that no conventional institution could provide, while teachers would find their own abilities enhanced in ways that would make their instruction more effective. The moment of recognition when they first glimpsed the site was profound for all four founders, though each experienced it according to their individual natures and backgrounds. Godric saw defensive possibilities that would make their school virtually impregnable against external threats, natural fortifications that would protect students and faculty, without requiring massive expenditure of resources on artificial barriers. Helga perceived healing energies that permeated the entire area, magical forces that would nurture growth and recovery in ways that could accelerate educational progress, while providing safety nets for students whose developing abilities might otherwise create dangerous situations. The environment itself would serve as co-educator, supporting their instructional efforts through influences that worked below the level of conscious awareness. Rowena recognized the fulfillment of prophetic vision with satisfaction that went beyond mere intellectual vindication to approach spiritual completion, understanding that her gift had guided them to exactly the place they needed despite challenges that conventional planning could not have overcome. The site had proven its value through practical results that would benefit generations of magical practitioners yet to be born. Salazar appreciated the strategic implications of their discovery, recognizing that control of such a location would provide advantages that extended far beyond educational applications into realms of political and economic influence. A school established here would inevitably become center of power that could shape developments throughout the magical community, making their enterprise significant beyond its immediate educational purposes. The unanimous decision to claim this site for their school was followed by immediate practical considerations that transformed abstract plans into concrete requirements demanding systematic attention. The magical construction project they were about to undertake would exceed anything that individual practitioners had previously attempted, requiring coordination of diverse talents and resources that would test their collaborative abilities to their absolute limits. The architectural planning alone presented challenges that went beyond normal building considerations to encompass magical engineering problems that had no precedence for guidance. They needed structures that could accommodate hundreds of students with widely varying abilities and needs, while providing teaching spaces that could support advanced magical instruction without creating hazards for beginners who might be present in adjacent areas. Rowena's contribution to the architectural planning reflected her understanding of how intellectual development required environments that challenged minds without overwhelming them with complexity that became counterproductive. The towers she envisioned would provide spaces where serious students could pursue advanced studies without distraction, while common areas would encourage the kind of informal exchange that often proved as educational as formal instruction. Her specific vision for what would become Ravenclaw Tower was particularly detailed, incorporating design elements that would stimulate intellectual curiosity while providing practical resources that scholarly pursuits required. The tower's height would offer perspectives that enhanced contemplation, while its internal organization would encourage systematic exploration of knowledge that built understanding layer upon layer like geological formations. The moving staircases that became Hogwarts' most distinctive architectural feature originated in Rowena's recognition that learning itself was dynamic rather than static, requiring structures that could adapt to changing needs rather than imposing fixed patterns that might become obstacles to intellectual growth. The castle would be a learning environment that continued to teach through its very structure, challenging students to think flexibly rather than accepting rigid categories. The collaborative magical construction process required months of intensive work that pushed all four founders to their physical and magical limits, combining their individual specialties in ways that created synergistic effects, exceeding what any conventional building technique could have achieved. The castle that emerged from their efforts was unprecedented in magical architecture, incorporating innovations that would influence construction projects for centuries to come. Godric's military engineering expertise ensured that their school would be capable of defending itself against threats that peaceful institutions normally would not need to consider, while maintaining the welcoming atmosphere that educational purposes required. The balance between security and accessibility was achieved through subtle design choices that provided protection without creating fortress mentality that could compromise the collaborative spirit essential for effective teaching. Helga's understanding of how environments influenced emotional and physical well-being shaped interior spaces that would nurture student development while providing the kind of comfort that made intensive study sustainable over extended periods. The kitchens and common areas she designed would become centers of community life that balanced individual achievement with collective identity. Salazar's historical knowledge informed design decisions that drew upon the most successful elements of previous magical institutions, while avoiding features that had proven problematic in other contexts. His contributions ensured that their school would benefit from accumulated wisdom while maintaining flexibility to adapt to circumstances that earlier institutions had not anticipated. The establishment of the sorting system represented their attempt to balance individual student needs with institutional requirements, creating method for organizing their school that could accommodate diverse learning styles while maintaining cohesion necessary for effective administration. Each founder would take primary responsibility for students whose characteristics matched their particular expertise, while maintaining overall commitment to the school's collaborative educational mission. Rowena's criteria for student selection reflected her understanding that intellectual ability without character would produce scholars whose knowledge served no worthwhile purpose, while character without capability would create good intentions that lacked means for effective implementation. Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure, became her guiding principle. But wit, in her understanding, encompassed wisdom, creativity, and judgment, as much as mere analytical capability. The early years of Hogwarts' operation validated their planning through practical results that exceeded even their optimistic projections, as students from throughout the British Isles sought education that their institution uniquely provided. The collaborative teaching methods they developed proved effective with learners whose backgrounds and abilities varied tremendously, while their systematic approach to magical instruction produced graduates whose capabilities set new standards for what magical education could accomplish. Yet success brought challenges that their initial planning had not fully anticipated. As the school's growing reputation attracted attention from political and religious authorities whose interests were threatened by educational innovations that challenged traditional power structures, the founders found themselves managing not just academic institution, but political entity whose influence extended far beyond its educational mission into realms where different rules applied and different skills were required. The philosophical differences among the founders, which had seemed manageable during the planning and construction phases, began to create tensions that threatened their collaborative effectiveness as operational pressures mounted and external challenges required responses that revealed incompatible priorities. Each founder's vision for what their school should become began to diverge in ways that would ultimately prove impossible to reconcile through mere discussion or compromise. But such conflicts lay in the future, beyond the immediate satisfaction of seeing their shared vision transformed into reality. Through dedication and sacrifice that had tested their individual limits, while demonstrating the power of properly coordinated collaborative effort, they had created something unprecedented in magical history, an institution that would influence developments throughout the wizarding world for centuries beyond their own lifetimes. The castle they had built stood as testament to the possibility of achieving grand purposes through the kind of patient, systematic effort that transcended individual ambition in service of ideals worthy of whatever prices their implementation demanded. Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry was their gift to future generations, their attempt to ensure that the knowledge and wisdom they had gained through painful experience would be preserved and transmitted to those who would carry magical civilization forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. The year 993 after the birth of Christ marked not just the beginning of their school, but the culmination of educational innovations that would reshape how magical knowledge was preserved, transmitted, and developed through systematic instruction that balanced individual achievement with collective advancement. They had succeeded in creating an institution that served purposes larger than any of their personal ambitions, while providing meaning that justified the sacrifices each had made in its service. The years that followed Hogwarts' founding brought a prosperity and academic excellence that validated every sacrifice the four founders had made in service of their unprecedented educational vision. Yet it was during this golden period that Rowena Ravenclaw faced the most profound personal challenge of her extraordinary life. The arrival of a new student in her house carried implications that extended far beyond normal pedagogical considerations into realms where her carefully maintained emotional detachment would be tested by forces that no amount of prophetic training had prepared her to handle with anything approaching objective clarity. Helena Ravenclaw entered the Great Hall on a September evening when the first chill of autumn touched the air like a promise of changes that would reshape everything familiar into something unrecognizable. Her presence commanding attention not through deliberate effort, but through the simple fact that she bore the unmistakable marks of her extraordinary heritage. The girl possessed her mother's sharp intelligence and penetrating gaze, yet these gifts were tempered by youth and uncertainty, that made her seem vulnerable in ways that Rowena had not been even as a child subjected to harsh prophetic training. The mystery surrounding Helena's paternity had been one of the few secrets that Rowena had successfully maintained, despite the intense scrutiny that her position as a founder inevitably attracted from colleagues and students alike. The identity of the man who had fathered her daughter remained locked away in memories that she shared with no one, protected by the same emotional barriers that had allowed her to function despite knowledge that would have destroyed minds less thoroughly prepared for the harsh realities of existence. Yet those who studied the historical records with sufficient dedication and analytical skill could piece together fragments of evidence that pointed toward conclusions both fascinating and tragic. The name Vortigern appeared in multiple contexts during the period when Helena would have been conceived, always associated with power and ambition that had ultimately led to destruction and exile. The Muggle chronicles spoke of a warlord whose hunger for dominance had made him vulnerable to manipulation by forces he could not understand or control. If the scholarly speculation possessed any foundation in truth, then Helena's parentage represented a connection between magical and mundane bloodlines that carried both extraordinary potential and terrible risks. The child of a seer, whose abilities had been refined through generations of careful breeding, and a warlord whose strength had reshaped entire kingdoms, might possess capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. But such gifts would come with prices that could prove devastating if not properly managed through education that acknowledged their dangerous potential. Rowena approached the challenge of educating her own daughter with the same methodical precision that characterized all her endeavors, yet she found herself struggling with emotional complexities that her training had not adequately prepared her to navigate successfully. The maternal instincts that she had thought were permanently suppressed through years of enforced attachment proved surprisingly resilient when confronted with the reality of a child who shared her blood and carried forward the legacy that had cost so much to establish. The educational methods that had proven successful with other students seemed inadequate when applied to someone whose potential clearly exceeded normal expectations, yet whose psychological needs remained those of a young person struggling to establish individual identity separate from overwhelming family history. Helena required challenge that would develop her exceptional abilities without creating the kind of emotional damage that Rowena herself had suffered under similarly demanding circumstances. Yet the more Rowena attempted to moderate her naturally harsh teaching style to accommodate her daughter's youth and inexperience, the more she found herself caught in contradictions that threatened to compromise both their relationship and Helena's educational development. Gentleness felt like betrayal of everything her own mother had taught her about the necessities that superior abilities imposed, while harshness seemed like deliberate cruelty towards someone she loved, despite her trained inability to express such emotions in conventional ways. The other students at Hogwarts quickly recognized Helena's unique position within the school's social hierarchy, understanding that she was simultaneously one of them and fundamentally different in ways that made normal friendship complicated, if not impossible. Her surname alone carried weight that influenced every interaction, marking her as heir to responsibilities that most of her peers could not imagine, and privileges that many secretly envied, despite their obvious costs. More troubling was the isolation that inevitably surrounded someone whose parentage made her a symbol rather than simply another student seeking education and social connection. Helena found herself trapped between the expectations that her mother's reputation created and her own desire to establish identity that went beyond mere reflection of family achievement. Every success was attributed to inherited advantages rather than personal effort, while every failure was interpreted as disappointing waste of exceptional potential. The pressure was intensified by Rowena's well-intentioned but ultimately counterproductive attempts to push her daughter toward achievements that would justify the sacrifices that had been made for her education and preparation. Each lesson became a test of worthiness. Each assignment an opportunity to prove that she deserved the attention and resources that her position demanded. Each interaction with her mother, a reminder that normal parent-child relationships were luxuries that those born to extraordinary circumstances could not afford. Helena's natural talents were considerable but not miraculous. Her intelligence sharp, but requiring development through the same patient effort that other gifted students needed to reach their potential. Yet the constant comparison to her mother's legendary abilities created expectations that transformed normal learning processes into sources of frustration and self-doubt that could have been avoided through more realistic assessment of what was actually possible for someone her age. The young man who would eventually be known as the Bloody Baron made his first appearance in Helena's life during her 3rd year at Hogwarts, when the tournament between houses created opportunities for students from different backgrounds to interact outside the formal classroom structure that normally maintained strict social boundaries. His noble birth and Slytherin affiliation marked him as someone whose ambitions extended beyond mere academic achievement into realms where political connections and family influence determined opportunities for advancement in the wider, magical world. Yet, beneath the aristocratic polish that his upbringing had provided, there burned obsessions that would prove both his greatest strength and ultimate weakness in his pursuit of Helena's affections. His love for her was genuine but possessive, protective but controlling, dedicated but ultimately destructive in ways that neither of them initially recognized or understood. He saw in her not just individual worth but symbolic importance, understanding that marriage to a founder's daughter would elevate his own status while providing him with connection to power that his family background alone could never achieve. Helena's response to his attentions was complicated by her own need for companionship that acknowledged her individual worth rather than simply her inherited position. His obvious devotion was flattering to someone who had spent most of her life feeling evaluated rather than appreciated, judged rather than loved, measured against impossible standards rather than accepted for qualities that made her unique among her peers. Yet, she also sensed something troubling in his intensity that her mother's training in reading people's deeper motivations had taught her to recognize as potentially dangerous. His love carried undertones of ownership that suggested he viewed her more as prize to be won than as person whose desires and preferences deserved consideration in their own right. The courtship that developed between them was marked by tensions that reflected these fundamental incompatibilities, even as surface interactions maintained the appearance of normal romantic development. Rowena watched her daughter's growing involvement with the Baron, with alarm that she found difficult to express without seeming to interfere inappropriately in Helena's personal life. Her prophetic abilities provided glimpses of potential futures that suggested tragic outcomes from what appeared to be innocent courtship. Yet the visions were too fragmentary and symbolic to serve as basis for specific warnings that Helena might take seriously enough to influence her behavior. More troubling was Rowena's recognition that her own harsh treatment of Helena had created emotional vulnerabilities that made her daughter particularly susceptible to attention that seemed to offer acceptance without the constant demands for perfection that characterized their mother-daughter relationship. The Baron's willingness to appreciate Helena without subjecting her to endless evaluations made him seem like refuge from pressures that were becoming increasingly unbearable. Yet Rowena also understood that attempting to forbid the relationship directly would likely drive Helena toward exactly the outcomes that prophetic insight suggested should be avoided at all costs. Her daughter possessed the same stubborn independence that had characterized the Ravenclaw bloodline for generations, making direct confrontation counterproductive when subtle guidance might achieve better results through patient application over extended periods. The strategy Rowena adopted was characteristically complex, involving careful manipulation of circumstances that would allow Helena to discover for herself the problematic aspects of the Baron's character, without recognizing that such discoveries were being orchestrated rather than occurring naturally. The approach required patience and restraint that tested her abilities in ways that combat with dark wizards never had, demanding skills that her education had not emphasized because they seemed irrelevant to the kind of challenges that seers normally faced. The academic pressures that Rowena maintained despite her growing concerns about Helena's personal relationships reflected her understanding that intellectual development could provide alternatives to romantic attachments that might prove problematic in the long term. A young woman whose abilities had been properly cultivated would have options that could make her less dependent on relationships that served others' needs better than her own, while superior education would provide perspectives that could help her evaluate potential partners more accurately. Yet the intensity of her educational demands also had the unintended consequence of driving Helena towards sources of comfort that seemed to offer relief from constant expectations for achievement that exceeded anything demanded of other students. The Baron's willingness to accept her without subjecting her to endless tests and evaluations made him seem like sanctuary from pressures that were becoming psychologically unsustainable. The other founders watched Rowena's struggles with her daughter's education with sympathy, tempered by recognition that their interventions might cause more harm than benefit in a situation that was already delicately balanced between multiple problematic possibilities. Helga's healing instincts made her want to provide emotional support that might ease the tensions between mother and daughter, while Godric's protective nature made him consider direct confrontation with the Baron, whose intentions seemed increasingly questionable. Salazar's approach was characteristically more calculating, recognizing opportunities that the situation might provide for advancing his own position within the school's power structure if handled with sufficient subtlety and patience. A founder whose attention was distracted by personal concerns might prove less effective at detecting and countering the kinds of institutional changes that he believed were necessary for Hogwarts to achieve its full potential. The graduation ceremony that marked Helena's completion of her formal education at Hogwarts was conducted with elaborate ritual that honored both her individual achievements and her symbolic importance as daughter of one of the school's founders. Yet beneath the celebratory atmosphere lay tensions that everyone present could sense but few could articulate. Awareness that endings often carried implications that extended far beyond their immediate significance into realms where different rules applied and different outcomes became possible. Helena's academic record was exemplary by any reasonable standard, demonstrating mastery of subjects that would have challenged students twice her age, while showing creativity and independence that suggested potential for original contributions to magical knowledge. Yet measured against the impossible expectations that her parentage had created, her achievements seemed adequate rather than extraordinary, successful rather than brilliant, competent rather than inspired. The disappointment that Rowena felt but could not express directly created additional strain in relationship that was already stretched beyond comfortable limits by years of accumulated pressure and unmet expectations. Her daughter had proven herself worthy of the education she had received, but worthiness felt like failure when measured against standards that had been established through comparison to legendary achievements that few practitioners in any generation could match. The Baron's presence at the graduation ceremonies carried implications that extended beyond normal celebration of academic achievement into realms where personal relationships intersected with political considerations that could influence the school's future development. His obvious devotion to Helena was matched by ambitions that seemed to encompass advantages that marriage to a founder's daughter would provide, making his courtship as much political calculation as romantic pursuit. Yet Helena's response to his continued attentions suggested emotional needs that her education had not adequately addressed, vulnerabilities that made her susceptible to relationships that might provide short-term comfort while creating long-term problems that would prove difficult to resolve through conventional means. Her mother's emphasis on intellectual development had not been balanced by attention to emotional growth that healthy relationships required. The months following Helena's graduation were marked by increasing tensions that reflected fundamental conflicts between her desire for independence and her mother's inability to release control over someone whose choices could affect not just individual welfare but the school's reputation and the broader magical community's perception of what the founders had accomplished through their collaborative efforts. Helena's decision to remain at Hogwarts rather than seeking opportunities elsewhere was interpreted by Rowena as lack of ambition rather than recognition of the valuable contributions she could make to the institution that had shaped her education. Yet staying also meant continued exposure to pressures and expectations that had made her student years increasingly difficult, while providing additional opportunities for the Baron to pursue courtship that seemed increasingly inevitable despite its obvious problematic aspects. The conflict between mother and daughter escalated gradually rather than erupting suddenly, building through accumulated frustrations and misunderstandings that reflected deep philosophical differences about what constituted worthy life and meaningful achievement. Rowena's values emphasized service to causes larger than individual happiness, while Helena sought forms of satisfaction that acknowledged her personal desires rather than subordinating them to abstract ideals. The breaking point approached like storm gathering beyond horizons visible to normal sight, its arrival inevitable, despite efforts to prevent or deflect conflicts that had been building for years through accumulated pressure that no relationship could sustain indefinitely. The choices that Helena would soon make were already taking shape in her mind, influenced by factors that extended beyond immediate circumstances into realms where different forms of wisdom applied and different outcomes became possible. Yet both mother and daughter remained unaware of how completely their personal struggles were intertwined with larger patterns of destiny that would soon reshape everything they thought they understood about their relationship, their responsibilities, and the prices that extraordinary abilities demanded from those who possessed them. The dance with fate continued, its steps becoming more complex as additional forces joined the performance, its music growing darker as individual melodies combined into harmonies that would soon resolve in ways that neither prophetic insight nor maternal love could prevent. The stage was set for tragedy that would test every lesson that Rowena had learned about acceptance and emotional detachment, every skill that Helena had developed in her struggle for independence and recognition. The future approached like tide that could not be turned back, carrying possibilities that would transform both their lives in ways that no amount of preparation or planning could adequately address. The theft occurred on a night when even the castle's ancient stones seemed to hold their breath in anticipation of betrayal, as if the very foundations of Hogwarts understood that something precious was about to be lost in ways that would echo through centuries of accumulated sorrow and regret. Helena Ravenclaw moved through the corridors she had known since childhood, with the silent grace of someone who had learned every secret passage and hidden alcove through years of seeking solitude from pressures that had grown unbearable, under the weight of impossible expectations and unattainable standards. The diadem rested in its place of honor within Rowena's private chambers, protected by wards that had been crafted specifically to prevent unauthorized access, while allowing legitimate approach by those whose intentions aligned with its creator's purposes. Yet Helena possessed knowledge that no external protection could guard against, understanding of her mother's magical techniques that came from years of observation and instruction, familiarity with the artifact's properties that made circumventing its defenses more matter of patience than power. Her motivations for the theft were complex beyond anything that simple rebellion could explain, rooted in desperation that had been building through years of living in shadow cast by achievements that seemed to diminish everyone who came after them. The diadem represented everything she had been told she should aspire to become, yet knew she could never truly achieve. Wisdom that transcended normal human limitations, intelligence that approached divine understanding, knowledge that could reshape reality itself through pure application of enhanced mental capability. Taking the artifact was simultaneously act of defiance against expectations that had crushed her spirit, and desperate attempt to prove that she possessed worth beyond mere reflection of her mother's legendary abilities. If she could demonstrate mastery of the diadem's power, if she could achieve something extraordinary through its enhancement of her natural gifts, then perhaps she could finally step out of Rowena's overwhelming shadow and establish identity that belonged to her alone, rather than to family legacy that had defined her existence since birth. The magical techniques required for safely removing the diadem without triggering protective responses tested every skill that her education had provided, demanding precision that left no room for error, while requiring emotional control that her current state made nearly impossible to maintain. Years of training in advanced magical theory served her well, as she systematically disabled each layer of protection. Yet the irony was not lost on her that she was using her mother's own teachings to steal from the woman who had sacrificed so much to provide such education. The moment her fingers touched the ancient circlet, Helena felt power flow through her consciousness like wine through parched earth. Her natural abilities suddenly amplified beyond anything she had previously experienced. The enhancement was intoxicating in its immediacy and scope, making problems that had seemed impossibly complex suddenly transparent to understanding that approached omniscience within specific domains of knowledge. Here was capability that could justify any risk, achievement that could validate any sacrifice. Yet alongside the exhilaration came recognition of the diadem's true nature as burden rather than blessing, tool that demanded prices from its users that went far beyond mere magical energy or physical exhaustion. The artifact enhanced intellectual capability while subtly eroding emotional connection, strengthening analytical power while weakening empathic understanding, providing clarity that came at the cost of the kind of wisdom that could only emerge from genuine human experience rather than artificial amplification. Her departure from Hogwarts was conducted with the same careful planning that had characterized the theft itself, though leaving required different skills than acquiring the diadem had demanded. The castle's protective systems were designed to prevent unauthorized entry rather than unauthorized departure, yet escaping without detection required navigation of social obstacles that magical ability alone could not overcome. The other students and faculty would not immediately notice her absence, as Helena had established patterns of solitary behavior that made extended disappearances seem normal rather than alarming. Her relationship with her mother had deteriorated to a point where days could pass without meaningful interaction, while her few friendships had been strained by pressures that made normal social connection increasingly difficult to maintain. The Baron's reaction to discovering her plans represented the first real obstacle to her escape, as his obsessive devotion made him far more attentive to her movements and emotional states than anyone else in the castle. His confrontation with her on the night of her departure revealed depths of feeling that went beyond normal romantic attachment into realms where love became indistinguishable from possession, protection from control, devotion from obsession. His offer to accompany her was motivated by genuine concern for her safety, combined with determination not to lose someone he viewed as rightfully belonging to him, regardless of her own preferences or desires. The intensity of his emotions was both flattering and terrifying, suggesting commitment that could overcome any obstacle yet might also destroy whatever it claimed to protect if that protection was unwanted or inappropriate. Helena's rejection of his assistance was based partly on practical considerations about the dangers that traveling companions might create, and partly on recognition that accepting his help would simply exchange one form of control for another potentially more problematic version. Her escape was motivated by desire for independence that companionship, however well-intentioned, would inevitably compromise through the kind of obligations and expectations that relationships always created. The argument that erupted between them revealed fundamental misunderstandings that had characterized their entire relationship, conflicts between his vision of protective partnership and her need for autonomous existence free from others' definitions of what her life should become. His inability to accept her refusal as final answer demonstrated possessive instincts that transformed love into something approaching tyranny, while her increasingly desperate assertions of independence only strengthened his conviction that she needed protection from her own poor judgment. The magical confrontation that concluded their encounter was brief but decisive, Helena's enhanced capabilities allowing her to overcome his resistance without causing permanent harm, while making clear that further interference would be met with force that could prove seriously damaging. The diadem's influence was already reshaping her approach to conflict resolution, making her more willing to use power to achieve desired outcomes, regardless of their emotional costs to others. Her journey across the British Isles, and eventually to the remote mountains of Albania, was guided by prophetic insights that the diadem's enhancement made more accessible and accurate than her natural abilities had ever provided. She could see potential futures branching from each decision, understand the probable consequences of different choices, navigate through possibilities with precision that approached supernatural guidance. Yet the enhanced foresight also revealed truths about her situation that unaugmented perception might have left mercifully unclear. The theft of such a significant magical artifact would inevitably be discovered. Her mother's response would be devastating in ways that went beyond mere personal betrayal, and the consequences of her actions would extend far beyond their immediate effects on her own life and circumstances. Most troubling were the visions that showed her various possible endings to her flight from responsibility and expectation, futures that ranged from triumph through successful establishment of independent identity to tragedy through miscalculations that could prove fatal to herself and others. The diadem's power allowed her to see these possibilities with clarity that made choice simultaneously easier and more difficult, as knowledge of consequences could be paralyzing when all available options carried significant risks. The isolation that had driven her to theft and flight was not ameliorated by distance from Hogwarts, but rather intensified by separation from the few genuine connections she had managed to maintain despite the pressures of her position. Traveling alone through territories where magical practitioners were viewed with suspicion or hostility created dangers that her enhanced abilities could not entirely overcome. While the diadem's influence made forming new relationships increasingly difficult, as her artificially enhanced intellect grew impatient with normal human limitations. Albania offered refuge primarily through remoteness rather than safety, its mountainous terrain providing concealment that magical means could enhance but not guarantee. The principality's political instability created opportunities for someone with her abilities to establish new identity and purpose, yet also generated threats that could prove fatal to travelers who lacked local connections or understanding of complex factional conflicts. The forest where she eventually established temporary sanctuary was ancient even by magical standards, its trees remembering times when the boundary between natural and supernatural was less clearly defined than later ages would insist upon maintaining. Here she could practice with the diadem's capabilities without risking discovery by authorities who might question her right to possess such powerful artifacts, while exploring enhancement possibilities that formal education had never encompassed. Yet solitude that had seemed like liberation from unbearable pressures gradually revealed itself as a different form of prison, one where intellectual capability was trapped within emotional isolation that made achievement meaningless through absence of anyone who could appreciate or share in whatever insights might be gained. Through artificial enhancement of natural abilities, wisdom without connection was merely sophisticated ignorance. Knowledge without application was academic exercise that served no purpose beyond its own accumulation. The months of exile provided time for reflection on choices that had brought her to circumstances that satisfied neither her desire for independence nor her need for meaningful existence. The diadem's power had indeed enhanced her intellectual capabilities beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. Yet the enhancement had not provided solutions to fundamental problems of identity and purpose that had motivated the theft in the first place. Meanwhile, at Hogwarts, Rowena's discovery of the missing diadem created crisis that tested every principle she had developed about emotional detachment and acceptance of circumstances beyond individual control. The artifact's absence was devastating not merely because of its practical value as a tool for enhancement of teaching and learning, but because its theft by her own daughter represented failure of relationship that she had thought was at least functional despite its obvious problems and tensions. The prophetic abilities that had guided her through previous crises provided glimpses of Helena's location and circumstances, yet the visions were filtered through emotional turmoil that made accurate interpretation nearly impossible. The same detachment that had allowed her to function during times of external threat became obstacle to understanding situation that required maternal insight rather than analytical assessment of strategic variables. Her decision to conceal the theft from the other founders reflected complex mixture of protective instinct toward Helena and recognition that revelation would create complications that might compromise the school's stability during a period when external pressures were already testing their collaborative unity. Admitting that one of the founders' children had stolen a significant magical artifact would raise questions about their fitness for the responsibilities they had assumed, while potentially providing ammunition for critics who opposed their educational innovations. The cover story she constructed was elaborate enough to explain the diadem's absence without revealing the true circumstances of its disappearance. Yet maintaining such deception required constant vigilance that added to stresses that were already approaching unbearable levels. Each lie demanded additional fabrications to support it, while the emotional cost of protecting Helena through dishonesty created internal conflicts that threatened the philosophical foundations on which her entire worldview rested. Her declining health during this period reflected not just the magical strain of maintaining complex deceptions, but the psychological toll of confronting failures that her training had not prepared her to handle successfully. The techniques that had allowed her to survive her mother's death and process other traumatic experiences proved inadequate when applied to situations that challenged her fundamental assumptions about duty, love, and the proper relationships between individual desires and larger responsibilities. The recurring visions that had haunted her childhood began to resurface with modifications that suggested their true meaning had been misunderstood rather than fulfilled through her mother's death. The white flowers, the woman's screams, the spreading blood, these images returned with greater clarity and urgency, carrying implications that extended beyond past tragedies into future catastrophes that might yet be prevented through proper interpretation and appropriate action. Yet the emotional turmoil that accompanied Helena's betrayal made accurate analysis of prophetic imagery nearly impossible, as personal investment in specific outcomes corrupted the detached objectivity that seer training had emphasized as essential for reliable interpretation of visionary information. Hope and fear battled within her consciousness, making it difficult to distinguish between genuine foresight and wishful thinking disguised as supernatural insight. The choice to send the Baron in pursuit of Helena was motivated by desperation rather than careful evaluation of available options, though Rowena rationalized the decision through analysis that emphasized his tracking abilities and demonstrated devotion to her daughter's welfare. His noble background provided resources that individual pursuit might lack, while his emotional investment would ensure persistence that mercenary assistance could never match. Yet, her prophetic abilities provided warnings about the Baron's psychological state that should have prevented such delegation of responsibility, glimpses of obsessive tendencies that could transform rescue mission into something far more dangerous for both pursuer and pursued. The enhanced perceptions that normally guided her decision-making were compromised by emotional involvement that made objective assessment impossible when clear thinking was most desperately needed. The Baron's eager acceptance of the assignment revealed depths of feeling that went beyond normal romantic attachment into realms where love became indistinguishable from possession, protection from control, service from self-interest. His vow to bring Helena home regardless of obstacles or resistance suggested commitment that could overcome any difficulty, yet might also create tragedies that more moderate approaches could have avoided. His departure from Hogwarts was conducted with ceremony appropriate to noble quest, though the ritual could not disguise underlying tensions that made everyone present uncomfortable, despite their inability to articulate specific reasons for their unease. The mission seemed both necessary and problematic, justified by circumstances, yet carrying implications that extended beyond immediate objectives into areas where different considerations might apply and different outcomes become possible. The weeks that followed brought no word from either Helena or her pursuer, creating vacuum of information that Rowena's imagination filled with possibilities ranging from successful reunion to catastrophic failure. Her prophetic abilities, normally reliable sources of guidance during times of uncertainty, provided only fragmentary glimpses that were too incomplete and ambiguous to support confident predictions about likely outcomes. The isolation that concealment of the crisis required prevented her from seeking comfort or advice from colleagues whose friendship might have provided support during a period of unprecedented personal difficulty. Maintaining deception about the diadem's disappearance meant facing her fears alone, processing her guilt and anxiety without benefit of perspectives that others might have offered if they had been permitted to understand the true nature of her circumstances. Her teaching responsibilities continued despite personal turmoil that made concentration on academic matters increasingly difficult, though students began to notice changes in her demeanor and approach that suggested problems extending beyond normal professional stresses. The precision and clarity that had characterized her instruction was replaced by distraction and emotional volatility that created uncertainty about standards and expectations that had previously been models of consistency. The other founders' growing concern about her condition created additional pressures as they attempted to understand changes in colleague whose stability had been cornerstone of their collaborative effectiveness. Their offers of assistance were well-intentioned, but necessarily inadequate, since they could not address problems whose true nature remained concealed from them. Through her determination to protect Helena, even at cost of her own well-being, the prophetic vision that finally provided clarity about Helena and the Baron's fate came not as gradual revelation but as sudden, devastating insight that shattered every hope she had maintained about possible, positive resolutions to situations that had already moved beyond redemption. The images were more vivid and specific than any she had previously experienced, carrying weight of absolute certainty that left no room for alternative interpretations or wishful denial. The white flowers were indeed soapwort, as she had suspected since childhood, but their location was Albanian forest rather than Scottish battlefield. The woman's screams were Helena's voice raised in terror and anguish as she faced death at hands of someone who claimed to love her more than life itself. The blood was her daughter's, spreading across pale petals in fulfillment of prophecy that had been misunderstood for decades but never escaped or altered through any effort or sacrifice. The realization that her recurring childhood visions had always referred to Helena, rather than her own mother, created retrospective understanding that transformed every choice and every sacrifice into links in chain of causation that led inevitably to tragedy that might have been prevented through different decisions made years or decades earlier. The education that had prepared her to survive her mother's death had simultaneously created conditions that made her daughter's death unavoidable. The letter she had been composing to Helena, filled with expressions of love and pride that her training had never allowed her to speak directly, remained unfinished on her desk as testament to maternal feelings that had existed, despite their inadequate expression throughout relationship marked by duty rather than affection, expectation rather than acceptance, judgment rather than unconditional support. The understanding that came too late was perhaps the cruelest aspect of prophetic revelation that illuminated truth only after opportunity for meaningful response had passed beyond recovery. She had spent her entire adult life preparing for responsibilities that required sacrifice of personal happiness. Yet, when faced with choice between duty and love, she had chosen duty while convincing herself that such choice served love's true purposes better than sentiment or indulgence could have managed. The patterns were clear now in ways that made their earlier obscurity seem willful rather than inevitable, as if she had chosen not to see connections that prophetic training should have made obvious to someone with her enhanced perceptual abilities. Her mother's harsh methods had indeed created daughter capable of surviving in a world where survival required hardness, but they had also created mother incapable of providing love that her own daughter desperately needed. The final irony was recognition that Helena's theft of the diadem had been motivated by same desire for maternal approval that had shaped Rowena's own childhood relationship with woman, whose love was expressed through demands that seemed impossible to satisfy. The artifact represented everything Helena had been told she should value, yet taking it had only confirmed her inadequacy rather than demonstrating her worthiness of recognition and acceptance. The knowledge that Helena was dead, killed by Baron, whose love had been transformed into murderous rage by her rejection of possessiveness disguised as devotion, created wound that no amount of philosophical preparation could make bearable. The emotional detachment that had protected her through previous losses proved useless against grief that challenged every assumption about the proper relationship between personal feelings and larger responsibilities. Yet even in the depths of loss that transcended anything her education had prepared her to endure, Rowena found herself analyzing the experience with intellectual precision that seemed almost insulting to magnitude of her emotional devastation. The prophetic training that had shaped her character continued to function even when its insights served no useful purpose beyond satisfying curiosity about patterns that could no longer be influenced through knowledge or action. The realization that she was becoming her mother, perpetuating cycle of emotional damage that stretched back through generations of women who had confused love with preparation for survival, provided final lesson about prices that extraordinary abilities demanded from those who possessed them. The gift that had seemed like blessing in youth had proven to be curse that destroyed everything it claimed to protect. Knowledge that arrived too late to serve any purpose, except illuminating the scope of failures that could never be corrected or forgiven. The Baron's pursuit of Helena, across the treacherous landscapes of medieval Europe, was driven by obsessions that transformed love into something approaching madness, devotion into possession, protection into the very forces that would ultimately destroy everything he claimed to cherish above his own life. His journey carried him through territories where political chaos and religious persecution created dangers that tested every skill his noble upbringing had provided. Yet, these external threats seemed insignificant compared to the internal torment that consumed him with each day that passed without success in his desperate quest. The magical tracking techniques at his disposal were considerable, enhanced by artifacts that his family's wealth and connections had made available despite their restricted nature and dangerous properties. Scrying mirrors that could pierce concealment charms, compass enchantments that responded to specific magical signatures, detection spells that could follow traces left by particular individuals across vast distances. All of these resources were brought to bear in service of determination that bordered on supernatural intensity. Yet Helena's flight had been planned with intelligence sharpened by the diadem's enhancement, her route calculated to minimize traces while maximizing confusion for anyone attempting pursuit. She had learned from her mother's teachings about prophetic evasion and anti-scrying techniques, applying lessons that had been intended for protection against dark arts practitioners to circumstances that Rowena's instruction had never anticipated or prepared for through specific guidance. The Baron's noble background provided advantages that ordinary pursuit could never have accessed, opening doors that were closed to common travelers, while providing resources that sustained extended investigation across multiple kingdoms and principalities. His family's political connections created networks of obligation and favor that could be called upon for assistance, while his personal wealth made possible expenditures that less fortunate pursuers could never have contemplated or sustained. But perhaps more significantly, his obsessive determination impressed even hardened professionals who made their livings through activities that required understanding of human motivation and psychological endurance. Mercenaries who had seen desperate men exhaust themselves in futile quests recognized something different in the Baron's commitment, intensity that suggested he would continue his pursuit until death made further effort impossible, rather than accepting defeat that preserved his life while abandoning his purpose. The months of fruitless searching tested his sanity in ways that physical hardship could never have achieved, as each false lead and disappointing revelation increased the pressure within his mind until rational thought became secondary to emotional need that consumed all other considerations. Sleep became elusive luxury, interrupted by dreams of finding Helena only to lose her again through his own inadequacy or hesitation, while waking hours were filled with self-recrimination about mistakes that might have allowed her to escape beyond his reach forever. His treatment of those who provided assistance or information deteriorated as frustration mounted and hope began to seem like mockery rather than motivation. Servants who failed to produce results quickly enough faced anger that was disproportionate to their actual failures, while innkeepers and guides who could not provide the specific intelligence he desperately needed found themselves subjected to intimidation that revealed darkness beneath his aristocratic polish. The transformation was gradual but inexorable, reshaping someone who had begun the quest with genuine concern for Helena's welfare into predator whose primary motivation had become assertion of ownership rights that he believed her flight had violated. Love was becoming indistinguishable from possession, while protection was evolving into control that would eliminate her ability to make choices that contradicted his vision of what their relationship should become. The breakthrough that finally provided concrete intelligence about Helena's location came through channels that his earlier self would have found morally repugnant. Information purchased from practitioners of arts that existed in shadows where conventional law and morality held no sway. But desperation had eroded ethical boundaries that peacetime prosperity had made easy to maintain, while extended exposure to the kind of people who traded in secrets had normalized approaches that aristocratic upbringing had originally made unthinkable. The Albanian mountains where Helena had taken refuge were notorious throughout the region for harboring fugitives whose crimes or circumstances made normal society too dangerous for survival. Political exiles, religious dissidents, practitioners of magical arts that various authorities had declared forbidden, all found sanctuary in territories where central control was weak, and local populations had learned that survival often required willful ignorance about their neighbors' backgrounds and activities. Yet the remoteness that provided protection also created vulnerabilities that skilled hunters could exploit through patient application of techniques refined through generations of predatory experience. The Baron's resources allowed him to purchase cooperation from locals whose knowledge of terrain and population could transform impossible search into methodical process of elimination that would eventually succeed regardless of how carefully his prey had concealed herself. The forest where Helena had established her temporary sanctuary was ancient beyond memory, its trees remembering times when the boundaries between natural and supernatural were less clearly defined than later ages would insist upon maintaining. Here she had found solitude that allowed intensive exploration of the diadem's capabilities without risking discovery by authorities or practitioners who might question her right to possess such powerful enhancement artifacts. Her months of isolation had been spent in magical research that pushed her abilities far beyond anything her formal education had encompassed, using the artifact's enhancement to explore theoretical possibilities that normal human intelligence could never have grasped or sustained through extended investigation. The knowledge she had gained was considerable, yet its acquisition had come at psychological costs that were becoming increasingly apparent as isolation took its toll on mental stability that required social connection for healthy maintenance. The diadem's influence had gradually reshaped her personality in ways that she was only beginning to recognize as problematic, making her more intellectually capable, while simultaneously reducing her capacity for emotional connection and empathic understanding. The enhancement that had seemed like pure benefit was revealing itself as transformation that preserved analytical ability, while eroding the human qualities that made such abilities meaningful through application to purposes that transcended mere intellectual exercise. Her awareness of the Baron's approach came through prophetic insights that the diadem's power had made more accessible and accurate than her natural abilities had ever provided. Yet the enhanced foresight also revealed truths about her situation that unaugmented perception might have left mercifully unclear. She could see potential futures branching from the approaching confrontation, understand the probable consequences of different responses, yet knowledge of outcomes could be paralyzing when all available options carried significant risks of catastrophic failure. The preparations she made for his arrival reflected both her enhanced capabilities and her deteriorating emotional state, as magical defenses of considerable sophistication were combined with psychological strategies that revealed how completely her isolation had damaged her ability to assess interpersonal situations with anything approaching normal accuracy. She was simultaneously more powerful and more vulnerable than she had ever been, intellectually enhanced yet emotionally compromised in ways that made effective decision-making nearly impossible. When the Baron finally discovered her forest refuge, his physical appearance provided shocking evidence of how completely his obsessive pursuit had consumed his health and sanity. The aristocratic polish that had once made him attractive to someone seeking relief from her mother's harsh expectations had been replaced by haggard desperation that spoke of months spent in conditions that his noble upbringing had never prepared him to endure without significant psychological damage. Yet beneath the obvious deterioration burned determination that seemed to have grown stronger rather than weaker through extended frustration and hardship. His love for Helena had been refined through suffering into something that transcended normal human emotion, becoming force of nature that would not accept defeat, regardless of obstacles or resistance that might be deployed against it. He had traveled too far and sacrificed too much to accept any outcome, except complete success in his quest to reclaim what he viewed as rightfully his. His initial approach was calculated to appeal to whatever remained of the affection that he believed Helena had once felt for him, emphasizing his devotion rather than his determination, his suffering rather than his anger, his willingness to forgive her flight rather than his intention to prevent any future attempts at independence. The performance was skilled despite his deteriorated condition, drawing upon aristocratic training in persuasion and manipulation that his family background had provided through education, designed to produce effective political operators. Helena's response revealed how completely her enhanced intellectual capabilities had been divorced from emotional wisdom through months of isolation and artificial augmentation. She could analyze his psychological state with supernatural accuracy, understanding exactly how his obsession had developed and what methods might be most effective for managing the confrontation. Yet this knowledge existed separately from empathic connection that might have suggested approaches based on compassion rather than tactical calculation. The conversation that developed between them was simultaneously intimate and alien, as two people who had once shared genuine affection attempted communication across psychological distances that had grown unbridgeable through their separate ordeals. His obsessive love had become incompatible with her need for independence, while her enhanced intellect had developed contempt for emotional displays that seemed primitive compared to the analytical clarity that the diadem's influence had made her primary mode of consciousness. His declaration of love was passionate and sincere despite its obvious problematic elements, revealing depths of feeling that normal relationships rarely achieved, yet also demonstrating possessive instincts that would make healthy partnership impossible. He spoke of devotion that would overcome any obstacle, commitment that would endure any hardship, protection that would shield her from every danger, including the consequences of her own poor judgment, in fleeing from circumstances that his presence could have made bearable. Her rejection was equally sincere, but delivered with intellectual precision that transformed what should have been emotional communication into clinical analysis of why their relationship could never achieve the success that his fantasies ambitioned. The diadem's influence made her approach the conversation as problem to be solved rather than human connection to be preserved or rebuilt, while her months of isolation had eroded whatever empathic abilities might have suggested gentler methods for conveying unwelcome truths. Yet, beneath her enhanced analytical capabilities lay recognition of darker truths about his character that her original affection had obscured or deliberately ignored. The intensity that had once seemed flattering was revealed as obsession that would sacrifice her autonomy for his emotional satisfaction, while the protection he offered was actually control that would eliminate her ability to make independent choices about fundamental aspects of her own existence. More troubling was her growing understanding of what he might be capable of if his reasonable appeals failed to achieve the compliance he demanded. The months of pursuit had revealed aspects of his personality that aristocratic polish had previously concealed, capabilities for violence and manipulation that suggested her safety might depend more on successful escape than on successful negotiation. The escalation from persuasion to threats was gradual but inevitable, as his growing frustration with her continued resistance overcame whatever restraints his noble upbringing had originally provided. The love that he proclaimed became indistinguishable from ownership, while his promises of protection transformed into warnings about consequences that her continued defiance might create for both of them. Helena's prophetic abilities, enhanced by the diadem's power, provided glimpses of potential futures that confirmed her worst fears about how the confrontation would end if she remained within his reach. The visions were fragmentary but consistent, showing violence that would result from his inability to accept rejection of claims that he viewed as legitimate, regardless of her own preferences or desires. Her attempt to flee deeper into the forest was hampered by terrain that favored someone familiar with hunting techniques over someone whose enhanced intellectual abilities provided little advantage in physical pursuit through difficult conditions. The Baron's noble background had included extensive training in tracking and capture of both human and animal prey, skills that proved devastatingly effective when applied to someone whose escape attempts were guided by theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience. The final confrontation took place in a clearing surrounded by white flowers that bloomed with innocent beauty, despite the violence that was about to unfold among them, their pale petals providing backdrop for tragedy that would fulfill prophecies that had been misunderstood for decades but never escaped through any effort or understanding. The soapwort swayed in breezes that seemed to carry whispers of approaching doom, their fragrance mixing with scents of fear and desperation that marked moments when destiny revealed its true intentions. Helena's enhanced abilities allowed her to understand exactly what was about to happen with clarity that made the experience simultaneously more and less bearable than ignorance might have provided. The diadem showed her potential escape routes that physical reality made impossible to reach, tactical options that her actual circumstances rendered meaningless, knowledge that served no purpose except illuminating the completeness of her entrapment. The Baron's final transformation from lover to murderer was triggered by her desperate assertion that she would never willingly return with him regardless of threats or promises he might make, that his obsession had destroyed whatever affection she had once felt and made any future relationship impossible, even if circumstances forced physical compliance with his demands. The truth that love could not survive the kind of possession he insisted upon was revelation that shattered his fundamental assumptions about the nature of their connection. The violence that erupted was swift but not merciful, driven by rage that had been building through months of frustration and denial, until it overwhelmed whatever rational control might have prevented complete catastrophe. His noble training in swordcraft served him well in ending her life with efficiency that spared neither of them extended suffering, though the psychological agony that accompanied physical death extended far beyond mere bodily destruction. Helena's final moments were marked by strange peace that came from recognition that her mother's prophetic training had been accurate about the inevitability of certain forms of destiny, that some patterns could not be escaped through any combination of intelligence, power, or determination. The diadem that had enhanced her capabilities while destroying her humanity fell from her head to rest among flowers that would soon be stained with blood, that fulfilled visions stretching back through generations of women who had paid similar prices for similar gifts. The Baron's immediate realization of what he had done was followed by despair that made continued existence seem impossible to endure. Understanding that his actions had destroyed the very person whose preservation had motivated every choice and sacrifice that had led to this moment of ultimate failure. The love that had driven his obsessive pursuit was revealed as force that contained seeds of its own destruction. Devotion that could not tolerate the independence that made its object worthy of such intense feeling. His suicide was conducted with the same precision that had characterized the murder. Noble training in efficient violence, serving final purpose that his family's education had never anticipated or intended. The blade that had ended Helena's life took his own with equal effectiveness, creating scene of mutual destruction that would haunt the forest clearing for centuries beyond their physical deaths. At Hogwarts, Rowena's prophetic vision of the tragedy unfolded with devastating clarity that transformed abstract fear into concrete knowledge of loss that could never be reversed or ameliorated through any action or understanding. The white flowers were indeed soapwort, as her childhood dreams had suggested, but their location was Albanian forest rather than Scottish battlefield. The woman's screams were Helena's voice raised in terror and anguish as she faced death at hands of someone who claimed to love her more than life itself. The blood that spread across pale petals in fulfillment of prophecy that had been misunderstood for decades but never escaped represented not just physical death but spiritual destruction that extended beyond individual tragedy into realms where patterns of behavior transmitted themselves across generations, like inherited diseases that could not be cured through mere recognition or good intentions. The letter that Rowena had been composing to her daughter remained unfinished on her desk as testament to maternal feelings that had existed despite their inadequate expression throughout relationship marked by duty rather than affection, expectation rather than acceptance, judgment rather than unconditional support. The words of love and pride that she had never been able to speak directly would remain undelivered, carrying weight of missed opportunities that had accumulated into insurmountable barriers between mother and daughter who had shared everything except understanding. The realization that her recurring childhood visions had always referred to Helena rather than her own mother created retrospective understanding that transformed every choice and every sacrifice into links in chain of causation that led inevitably to tragedy that might have been prevented through different decisions made years or decades earlier. The education that had prepared her to survive her mother's death had simultaneously created conditions that made her daughter's death unavoidable through repetition of patterns that seemed to possess independent existence beyond individual will or conscious choice. The understanding that came too late was perhaps the cruelest aspect of prophetic revelation that illuminated truth only after opportunity for meaningful response had passed beyond recovery. She had spent her entire adult life preparing for responsibilities that required sacrifice of personal happiness. Yet when faced with ultimate choice between wisdom and love, she had chosen wisdom while convincing herself that such choice served love's true purposes better than sentiment or emotional indulgence could have managed. The final irony was recognition that Helena's theft of the diadem had been motivated by same desire for maternal approval that had shaped Rowena's own childhood relationship with women whose love was expressed through demands that seemed impossible to satisfy. The artifact had represented everything Helena had been told she should value, yet possessing it had only confirmed her inadequacy, rather than demonstrating her worthiness of recognition and acceptance that her mother's training had made impossible to provide. The knowledge that her daughter was dead, killed by man whose love had been transformed into murderous rage, through rejection of possessiveness, disguised as devotion, created wound that no amount of philosophical preparation could make bearable. The emotional detachment that had protected her through previous losses proved useless against grief that challenged every assumption about proper relationship between personal feelings and larger responsibilities that her education had established as fundamental truths. Yet even in depths of loss that transcended anything her training had prepared her to endure, Rowena found herself analyzing experience with intellectual precision that seemed almost insulting to magnitude of her emotional devastation. The prophetic abilities that had shaped her character continued to function even when their insights served no useful purpose beyond satisfying curiosity about patterns that could no longer be influenced through knowledge or action. The realization that she had become her mother, perpetuating cycle of emotional damage that stretched back through generations of women who had confused love with preparation for survival, provided final lesson about prices that extraordinary abilities demanded from those who possessed them. The gift that had seemed like blessing in youth had proven to be curse that destroyed everything it claimed to protect, wisdom that arrived too late to serve any purpose, except illuminating scope of failures that could never be corrected or forgiven. The heart that had been trained to value mind above emotion finally understood that such training had been preparation for tragedy rather than triumph. Education that created capabilities for extraordinary achievement while destroying capacity for ordinary happiness that made such achievement meaningful. Helena's death was both consequence and condemnation of philosophical approaches that treated love as weakness rather than strength, connection as vulnerability rather than source of power that transcended individual limitation. In the silence that followed prophetic revelation, Rowena sat surrounded by books and artifacts that represented lifetime of accumulated knowledge, understanding that wisdom without love was merely sophisticated ignorance. Intelligence without empathy was enhanced capacity for causing harm rather than healing it. The diadem that her daughter had died possessing was symbol of everything she had been taught to value, yet its enhancement came at cost of everything that made enhancement worthwhile. The weight of final understanding settled on her shoulders like cloak woven from all the sorrows that extraordinary gifts had brought to those who possessed them. Recognition that true wisdom lay not in transcending human limitation, but in accepting it, not in rising above emotional connection, but in embracing it as source of meaning that gave purpose to whatever capabilities individuals might develop through dedication and sacrifice. The death that would soon claim her was already approaching through pathways that grief had carved in her magical core, understanding that some losses were too great for even enhanced human constitution to survive without fundamental transformation that amounted to death of everything that had made survival seem worthwhile. She had achieved everything her education had prepared her to accomplish, yet success felt like failure when measured against what had been lost in its pursuit. The news of Rowena Ravenclaw's death spread through Hogwarts like winter frost, touching every stone and every soul within the castle walls with the kind of profound silence that follows the departure of forces too fundamental to be easily replaced or understood. Her passing was not marked by the dramatic circumstances that had characterized so many pivotal moments in magical history, but by the quiet fading of someone whose heart had simply grown too weary to continue beating under the weight of griefs that transcended normal human capacity for endurance and recovery. The other founders discovered her in the tower chamber that had served as her private study, surrounded by the books and artifacts that represented a lifetime of accumulated wisdom, her face bearing an expression of peace that had been absent during her final months of torment over Helena's fate. The letter to her daughter lay unfinished upon her desk, its incomplete sentences speaking of love that had existed despite its inadequate expression, pride that had been genuine despite its harsh manifestation, regret that would remain forever unresolved. Godric's response to the loss was characteristic of his direct nature, grief expressed through immediate action, as he took upon himself the practical responsibilities that Rowena's death had created for the school's continued operation. Her classes required instruction that only someone with comparable knowledge could provide, while her administrative duties demanded attention to details that had been invisible to the other founders, until their sudden importance became undeniable through her absence. Yet beneath his efficient handling of immediate necessities lay recognition that they had lost something irreplaceable, wisdom that had guided their collaborative efforts since the earliest days of their friendship. Rowena's analytical abilities had provided perspective that balanced his own instinctive responses, while her prophetic insights had warned them of dangers that conventional thinking would never have anticipated or prepared for through adequate countermeasures. Helga's mourning was deeper but less visible, expressing itself through intensified dedication to the healing arts that had always been her primary contribution to their shared enterprise. She understood better than the others how completely Rowena's harsh exterior had concealed vulnerabilities that made her tragedy inevitable once certain patterns had been set in motion, recognizing parallels with her own background that suggested how easily protective mechanisms could become destructive forces when applied without sufficient wisdom or moderation. Her attempts to process the loss through her healer's understanding of grief revealed complexities that challenged her optimistic worldview, forcing recognition that some forms of suffering could not be ameliorated through compassion or understanding, but could only be endured until they either transformed into wisdom or destroyed those who carried them. Rowena's death was less about prices that extraordinary abilities demanded from their possessors, costs that no amount of preparation or support could entirely eliminate. Salazar's reaction was more complex and ultimately more problematic, as he saw in Rowena's passing an opportunity to reshape the school's direction according to principles that her influence had previously kept in check. Her commitment to educating all students, regardless of blood status or background, had been cornerstone of their original vision, yet her absence created possibilities for changes that could make Hogwarts more effective by focusing its resources on those most capable of benefiting from advanced instruction. The philosophical debates that had been manageable disagreements among friends became fundamental conflicts over the school's mission and methods, once the mediating influence of her analytical perspective was removed from their deliberations. The unity that had made their collaboration possible was beginning to fracture under pressures that her presence had helped them navigate through careful compromise and mutual respect. The immediate challenge of replacing her as head of Ravenclaw House required careful consideration of candidates whose abilities could match the standards she had established, while acknowledging that no single individual could adequately fill the void her death had created. Her teaching methods had been uniquely suited to students whose intellectual gifts required challenge and stimulation that conventional approaches could not provide, making succession a matter of institutional survival as much as administrative convenience. The solution that emerged was characteristically innovative, distributing her responsibilities among multiple faculty members whose combined expertise could approximate the comprehensive knowledge she had brought to her educational duties. Advanced theoretical instruction was assigned to specialists in particular subjects, while pastoral care for Ravenclaw students was entrusted to teachers whose emotional wisdom could complement the intellectual rigor that defined the house's academic culture. Yet, the most significant aspect of Rowena's legacy was not in specific techniques or particular innovations, but in the educational philosophy that had shaped every aspect of her approach to teaching and learning. Her understanding that true wisdom required integration of intellectual capability with emotional maturity had influenced curriculum development and assessment methods throughout the school, creating institutional culture that valued growth over mere achievement, understanding over simple memorization. The tower that bore her name became shrine to this philosophy, its design continuing to challenge students in ways that honored her memory while serving practical educational purposes that she had envisioned during the castle's construction. The moving staircases and shifting architecture encouraged adaptability and creative thinking, while the common room's placement high above the surrounding landscape provided perspectives that stimulated contemplation and reflection. Her portrait, when it finally appeared in the gallery reserved for former headmasters and notable faculty, proved to be remarkably lifelike in its ability to provide guidance that reflected her analytical approach to problem-solving. Students who sought advice found themselves challenged to think more deeply about their assumptions and motivations, while faculty members discovered insights that helped them navigate complex educational situations with wisdom that drew upon her decades of experience. The library that she had helped establish became a repository not just for books and manuscripts, but for the kind of systematic approach to knowledge that had characterized her scholarly methodology. Her cataloging systems and research techniques influenced how information was organized and accessed, while her emphasis on primary sources and critical analysis shaped how students learned to evaluate the reliability and significance of various forms of evidence. The Sorting Hat's decision-making process bore permanent influence from the criteria she had established for Ravenclaw House selection. Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure, remaining the guiding principle for identifying students whose intellectual gifts would flourish under the kind of rigorous instruction that her house specialized in providing. Yet, the implementation of this principle reflected her understanding that intelligence without character was dangerous, while character without capability was merely well-intentioned inadequacy. The generations of students who passed through Ravenclaw House carried forward her influence in ways both obvious and subtle, their approaches to learning shaped by traditions that reflected her educational philosophy, even when they had no direct knowledge of its origins. The emphasis on questioning assumptions, seeking deeper understanding, and applying knowledge in service of worthy purposes became cultural inheritance that influenced how Ravenclaws approached not just academic challenges, but life decisions that required wisdom rather than mere cleverness. Her impact on magical education extended far beyond Hogwarts through students who became teachers themselves, carrying her methods and principles to other institutions throughout the wizarding world. The analytical techniques she had developed for evaluating student potential were adopted by schools across Europe, while her innovations in curriculum design influenced how magical subjects were taught for centuries beyond her death. The tragedy of Helena's death and the circumstances surrounding it became cautionary tale that was preserved in various forms throughout magical literature, though the specific details were often altered or obscured to protect the privacy of those involved, while maintaining the essential lessons about the dangers of pursuing knowledge for its own sake, without considering the human costs such pursuit might entail. The Ravenclaw diadem itself entered into legend during this period, its location unknown, but its significance understood by those who studied the history of magical artifacts and their effects on those who possessed them. Scholars speculated about its capabilities while warning about the psychological risks that such enhancement might create, understanding that power without wisdom could be more dangerous than ignorance without ability. The Albanian forest where Helena and the Baron had died became a place of pilgrimage for those who sought to understand the tragedy, though few visitors found anything more than ordinary woodland that showed no signs of the violence that had occurred among its trees. The soapwort continued to bloom each spring with innocent beauty that seemed to mock the significance that prophecy had attached to its pale petals, while the clearing where blood had been spilled was reclaimed by natural growth that erased all physical evidence of human tragedy. Yet those with enhanced perception sometimes reported strange phenomena in the area. Cold spots that suggested supernatural presence, sounds that resembled distant conversation or argument, glimpses of figures that vanished when observed directly. Whether these experiences represented genuine supernatural manifestations or psychological projections created by knowledge of the location's history remained matter of debate among those who studied such phenomena. The story of mother and daughter, locked in tragic patterns that neither could escape despite their extraordinary abilities, became archetypal example of how gifts that seemed like blessings could transform into curses when not properly balanced by wisdom and compassion. The Ravenclaw family's fate served as reminder that intellectual capability, without emotional intelligence, was incomplete preparation for the challenges that life inevitably presented to those who sought to make meaningful differences in the world. The broader magical community's response to Rowena's death reflected complex mixture of genuine loss and political calculation, as various factions sought to interpret her legacy in ways that supported their own agendas and priorities. Some emphasized her dedication to pure knowledge and intellectual achievement, while others focused on her commitment to educating students regardless of their backgrounds or family connections. The Ministry of Magic's official response was characteristically bureaucratic, offering condolences that were formal rather than personal, while avoiding any commitments to preserving or continuing the educational innovations she had pioneered. Political considerations made it inadvisable to become too closely associated with experimental approaches to magical instruction that might prove controversial or problematic if they produced unexpected results. Yet, among practicing educators and serious scholars, her influence continued to grow, rather than diminish with time, as her methods proved their effectiveness through the achievements of students who had learned to think analytically and approach problems with systematic rigor. The intellectual tools she had developed for processing complex information and drawing valid conclusions from incomplete evidence became standard techniques that were taught throughout the magical world. Her personal manuscripts and research notes, discovered among her effects after her death, provided insights into the depth and sophistication of her scholarly methodology, while revealing the emotional struggles that had accompanied her intellectual achievements. These documents became primary sources for later generations, seeking to understand how she had developed her revolutionary approaches to education and knowledge management. The relationship between her public persona and private reality proved to be more complex than most contemporaries had realized, as her correspondence revealed someone whose harsh exterior had concealed genuine affection for students and colleagues despite her inability to express such feelings in conventional ways. Her critiques of others' work were motivated by desire to help them achieve their full potential, rather than by desire to demonstrate her own superiority. The philosophical questions raised by her life and methods continued to challenge educators long after her death, as each generation grappled with tensions between excellence and compassion, achievement and emotional well-being, individual development and social responsibility. Her example provided both inspiration and warning about the prices that dedication to worthy causes could exact from those who served them without adequate attention to their own human needs. The evolution of Ravenclaw house culture after her death reflected attempts to preserve her essential insights while moderating some of the harsher aspects of her approach that had contributed to the tragedy that claimed Helena's life. The emphasis on intellectual achievement remained paramount, but it was balanced by greater attention to student emotional development and social connection that could provide support during difficult periods. The traditions that emerged from this evolution became distinguishing characteristics of Ravenclaw House that persisted for centuries, creating culture that valued both scholarly excellence and personal growth, analytical rigor and creative expression, individual achievement and collaborative learning. Students learned to push themselves toward excellence while maintaining perspective that prevented academic pressure from becoming psychologically destructive. The moving staircases and shifting architecture that Rowena had designed continued to challenge new generations of students their unpredictable changes serving as constant reminders that learning required adaptability and creative thinking rather than mere memorization of fixed patterns. The castle itself became co-educator, teaching lessons about flexibility and innovation that complemented the formal instruction provided by human teachers. Her influence on the development of magical theory extended far beyond educational applications into research methodologies that advanced understanding in fields ranging from transfiguration to divination. The analytical frameworks she had developed for processing prophetic information proved applicable to other forms of uncertain or incomplete data, while her emphasis on systematic observation and careful documentation became standard practices throughout the scholarly community. The library systems she had established became models that were copied by institutions throughout the magical world. Her innovations in information, organization, and retrieval making possible research projects that would have been impractical using traditional methods. The card catalogs and cross-reference systems she developed remained in use for centuries, while her principles for evaluating source reliability influenced how scholars approached primary and secondary materials. The international reputation that Hogwarts achieved during her lifetime continued to grow after her death, as her educational innovations attracted attention from magical communities throughout Europe and beyond. Students traveled from distant countries seeking instruction that incorporated her methods, while foreign educators visited the school to observe techniques that were producing graduates of exceptional capability and character. Yet the most enduring aspect of her legacy was not any particular technique or innovation, but the example she had provided of intellectual honesty combined with dedication to worthy purposes. Her willingness to acknowledge when her theories proved incorrect, to modify her methods when experience suggested improvements, and to subordinate personal preferences to educational effectiveness became model for how scholarly inquiry should be conducted. The cautionary aspects of her story were equally significant, serving as reminders that intellectual gifts, unbalanced by emotional wisdom, could lead to tragic outcomes, despite the best intentions. Her relationship with Helena became case study in how parental expectations could damage children even when motivated by genuine love and concern, while her own fate demonstrated that knowledge without connection to sources of meaning and joy could become burden rather than blessing. The recognition that she had ultimately failed in one of her most important relationships, despite her extraordinary capabilities, provided sobering perspective on the limitations of intellectual achievement when divorced from emotional understanding. Her story became a reminder that success in academic or professional realms could not compensate for failures in personal relationships that gave life its deepest meaning. The memorials that were established in her honor throughout the magical world reflected different aspects of her complex legacy, some emphasizing her scholarly achievements, while others focused on her dedication to education and student development. Libraries, research institutes, and schools bore her name, while scholarships and academic prizes were established to support students whose intellectual gifts might otherwise go undeveloped due to economic circumstances. Yet perhaps the most fitting memorial was the continuation of the educational traditions she had established, as generation after generation of students learned to think critically, question assumptions, and apply knowledge in service of purposes larger than individual advancement. Her influence lived on in minds she had shaped and perspectives she had broadened, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond anything she could have imagined during her lifetime. The final irony of her legacy was recognition that her greatest achievement might have been demonstrating both the possibilities and limitations of intellectual excellence when pursued without adequate attention to emotional wisdom and human connection. Her life served as both inspiration and cautionary tale, showing how extraordinary gifts could produce extraordinary results while exacting prices that no individual should have to pay alone. In the quiet moments when students sat in Ravenclaw Tower contemplating the challenges that lay before them, they were surrounded by the spirit of someone who had pushed the boundaries of what was possible while paying ultimate price for such ambition. Her presence lingered, not as ghost or supernatural manifestation, but as influence that continued to shape how learning occurred and how knowledge was pursued in service of ideals that transcended individual achievement. The tower where she had lived and worked became shrine to the proposition that learning was a lifelong journey rather than destination, process of growth that required courage to face uncomfortable truths and wisdom to balance intellectual achievement with human connection. Her legacy lived on in every question asked, every assumption challenged, every effort to understand the world more deeply and serve it more effectively. The education she had pioneered continued to evolve and develop long after her death, as new generations of teachers built upon foundations she had established while addressing challenges she had never anticipated. Yet the essential principles she had discovered, that learning required both rigor and compassion, that knowledge without wisdom was dangerous, that individual achievement meant nothing unless it served larger purposes, remained constant guides for those who sought to honor her memory through their own dedication to worthy causes. Rest now, dear seeker of wisdom, as our tale of Rowena Ravenclaw draws to its gentle close. In the quieting darkness of this sacred hour, let yourself be comforted by the memory of a brilliant mind that burned too brightly for this world to contain, yet whose light continues to illuminate the path for all who dare to ask the deeper questions. Her story reminds us that true wisdom lies not in the accumulation of facts, but in understanding the delicate balance between mind and heart, between knowledge and compassion, between the pursuit of excellence and the acceptance of our beautifully flawed humanity. As you drift toward dreams, remember that Rowena's greatest lesson was learned too late, but lives on in every student who sits in that high tower, surrounded by stars and possibilities. The diadem may be lost to shadow and legend, but the true treasure she discovered, that wit beyond measure means nothing without love beyond measure, echoes through every corridor of Hogwarts still. Her tragedy teaches us that the brightest flame can burn out, but her legacy proves that the ideas we share, the minds we nurture, and the love we dare to give, despite our fears, can shine eternal. Sleep peacefully now, knowing that somewhere in a castle tower, students still reach for wisdom while learning the most important magic of all, that intelligence without kindness is merely clever cruelty, but knowledge paired with compassion can indeed change the world. Sweet dreams, and may your mind soar as high as Ravenclaw Tower, but may your heart remain always grounded in the connections that make such soaring worthwhile.